I'd like to welcome you back to the Baptist Particular Podcast, an analysis of particular Baptist history and theology from a hyper-Calvinist point of view. My name is Jared Smith. I'm the curator and editor for the online resources at Baptists.net, and I'm also your host for this program, and I'm pleased you've joined me. Before I enter our subject, I'd like to make reference to the comments section. That is, if you're watching this podcast on a platform which allows you to make a comment, you'll notice some guidelines have been added. This has been done in order to preserve good etiquette and maintain a positive experience for our little community. Recently, there was an unpleasant encounter, and we certainly don't want to see that repeated. And I also don't want the comment section to be disabled just because there's a few contentious people looking for an argument. I want you to know you're more than welcome to share your view, whether we agree or disagree. We simply ask that you show kindness, you stay on point, and you don't engage in protracted back and forths. The comment section, at least for this platform, is not a debate forum. Now, I'm certain if you're looking for something of that kind, there's plenty of online chat groups hosted on other platforms where you can argue to your heart's content. We assume on this platform the policy which governed the ministry of Martyn Lloyd-Jones. We don't engage in fruitless debates, as they're not only unedifying to the Lord's people, but dishonoring to the Lord himself. So, while we discourage a certain kind of communication, we hope you'll feel welcome to leave a comment if you have something meaningful to contribute, or if you have a question for clarification, and we trust the Lord will bless the interactions. And if you're looking to engage with me personally, then I recommend you send a message using the contact form at Baptists.net. Now, to the subject at hand. As you can see from the title, I'll be speaking about the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. I pointed out towards the end of the previous episode that the 18th century produced two leading theologians among the particular Baptists, John Gill and Andrew Fuller. I mentioned that I would be diagramming the theological framework of both men for this episode. But it occurred to me, as I was preparing my thoughts, that it would be helpful if I first say something about the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller in general, before I enter into the details of his theology. Since my focus will be on the systematic theology of Fuller, with that of Gill being given for comparative purposes only, it seems appropriate, therefore, that we first consider how the Reformed Baptist movement appraises the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller today. You know, I've noticed over the last 2 to 3 decades that the name Andrew Fuller has become increasingly popular within Reformed circles. I remember during the 1990s, it was a name that was only beginning to gain traction. Various scholars and authors were talking about him, but the average preacher and pew sitter hadn't yet picked up on his name. I was, at that time, a member of a Calvinistic church in London, and having a line of visiting preachers to the pulpit, it was few and far between when Andrew Fuller's name was mentioned, although it was referenced on occasion. It's only been within the last 20 to 25 years that Andrew Fuller has become more of a household name, at least within Reformed Baptist circles, and this should tell us something about his teachings and legacy. His popularity in my view, has grown in no small measure by the leaders within the Grace Baptist community scattered across England. Be mindful, the Reformed Baptists in England are identified as Grace Baptist churches, but also the leaders of the Founders Ministry in America. This, of course, is the counterpart of the Reformed Baptists in England. And also the Andrew Fuller Center for Baptist Studies, located in Louisville, Kentucky. This is an organization created specifically for the purpose of promoting the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. These groups take the view that Andrew Fuller was one of, if not the greatest, Baptist theologian of all time. Now, this was not a new phenomenon which emerged during the 1990s. I mean, we find references to Andrew Fuller as early as the first issue of the Reformation Today magazine, printed in the year 1970. Errol Hulse, the founder and editor of that magazine, elevated Fuller to a greater stature than the eminent John Gill. I know the Grace magazine, which was a national paper designed for the Reformed Baptist churches scattered around England. It also afforded Fuller with the same honor. And of course, the Banner of Truth, although not a Baptist publication, came out on the side of the Reformed Baptists, touting Fuller as a great theologian indeed. In 1988, Banner of Truth published an article entitled Voice of Years, an appraisal of William Huntington. The piece was a review of an obscure booklet of less than 100 pages in length, published in 1814, entitled The Voice of Years. This little book was printed the year after the death of William Huntington and was a type of satire, highly critical of Huntington's gospel ministry. William Huntington, of course, was a hyper-Calvinist preacher and a prolific writer, one of the most influential gospel preachers of the 18th and 19th centuries, and whose influence transcended denominational lines. In fact, he attracted large crowds from every station of life, from the poor, downcast members of society to members of the royal family and the Prime Minister himself. Although his style was eccentric, to say the least, yet his theology was God-honoring, Christ-glorifying, and man-degrading, and therefore he drew a large amount of criticism from free will works religionists. Among them, of course, was Andrew Fuller himself, who despised Huntington's free grace teachings. In fact, one of the last things Fuller wrote before his death was a review of this satire against William Huntington. You can find it for the July issue of the 1815 Baptist magazine. In any case, this little satire had been lost to history, for its criticisms had been dispelled almost 100 years before by English historian and biographer Thomas Wright, who wrote a biography of William Huntington, published in the year 1909, wherein he supplied ample testimony which completely discredited the terrible accounts recorded in the satire. One such testimony was by a Samuel Adams, and therefore I like to quote for you from Wright's book on this testimony by Samuel Adams. These are the words of Wright, the biographer. Another ardent admirer of Huntington was the Reverend Samuel Adams, vicar of Thornton, he says, "For the last 2 years of his ministry, I attended Providence Chapel with my father. Every Sunday and Wednesday evening I heard him, and, consequently, heard his last remarkable and solemn sermon, which I shall never forget. I have collected all things Huntington published, and every scrap, sentence, and letter I could respecting him. Someone published a small pamphlet after his death called The Voice of Years. I consider it a most unjust and unfair statement." Well, that's the testimony of Samuel Adams, recorded by the biographer Wright. Nevertheless, this little pamphlet was resurrected in 1988, just under 100 years later. And the Banner of Truth led a front-on attack against the life and ministry of William Huntington. By so doing, it exposed its underbelly, if I may borrow the analogy, to be infected with the ticks of Fullerism. And thus began the public ministry of George Ella. George Ella protested against the Banner of Truth, allowing on its pages the slander of a faithful gospel preacher who for no apparent cause was unjustly attacked. The only reasonable explanation for the Banner of Truth resurrecting such an obscure pamphlet and the writing a review almost 170 years after it was first published was that the Banner of Truth was looking to distinguish itself from hyper-Calvinism, affirming its commitment to the tenets of moderate Calvinism. However, as the past 30 years demonstrate, Banner of Truth seems to have adopted, in addition to the moderate Calvinism, the modifications introduced by Andrew Fuller. To my knowledge, it was actually this review, published by the Banner of Truth in the year 1988, which led George Ella to publish in 1994 his biography entitled William Huntington, Pastor of Providence. The book was reviewed in November of the same year by the Gospel Standard magazine, and I like to read to you a portion of that review. This is the Gospel Standard for the month November of 1994. Today there is much confusion in the evangelical world and much uncertainty of doctrine and experience among those who claim to be Calvinistic. Dr. Ella shows how the errors of Baxter and Fuller are being propagated today in evangelical circles. In fact, their works are reprinted and being widely advocated. A lengthy appendix of 22 pages, Fullerism Weighed and Found Wanting, exposes the unscriptural and unsound nature of the teaching of Andrew Fuller. And yes, there is an excellent summary of Andrew Fuller's teachings in the appendix of Ella's book. And I encourage you to purchase the book and have a read. I believe Go Publications has recently produced a modern version of this book. I also believe the summary of Fuller's teachings in the appendix of Ella's book, it's one of the first public statements he made on the heretical views of Andrew Fuller, and therefore it is worth your effort to track down the book and have a read at his views. Of course, I've gone into all of this detail by way of a long introduction because I'm laying out for you, or at least trying to lay out for you, how the teachings of Fuller remain alive today not only among the Reformed Baptists, but even the wider circle of Reformed denominations. And if you know anything about these issues within the context of the last 30 years, then you'll understand that George Ella has been the leading spokesman against the teachings of Fuller and a defender of the faith for the cause of God and truth. It's therefore helpful to you, the viewer, to know who George Ella is, as well as the doctrinal position maintained by mainstream Reform groups. And so, the question remains, was Andrew Fuller a defender or denier of the faith? Was he a conservative and orthodox theologian or a liberal heretic? Was he a so-called strict Calvinist, or did he modify 17th century Calvinism? Did he rescue the particular Baptist churches or destroy them? Was he a promoter of evangelism or of proselyting? The answer to these questions depends upon who you ask. And for the remainder of this episode, I like to give you both sides of the answer. And to that end, I've arranged my thoughts under 6 headings. Let me introduce to you the headings, the chapter headings, and after each chapter, as usual, I'll be taking a short break. You're invited to do the same, and then we'll move on to the next section. The first chapter heading will be my appraisal of Andrew Fuller from a historical perspective. Now, when I say non-reformed, I mean I do not identify with the moderate Calvinism of the Reformed teachings in our day. I'm a historic hyper-Calvinist, and I align with the teachings of the particular Baptists. The second chapter will be Jack Hode's appraisal of Andrew Fuller. He says, in essence, Fuller's book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, became God's instrument for founding world missions. The third chapter will be Kenneth Dix's appraisal of Andrew Fuller. He says, Fuller never gave up the 17th century confessions. The fourth chapter will be Tom Nettle's appraisal of Andrew Fuller. He says, Fuller's teachings were grounded in biblical exposition and theological reflection that will serve the cause of truth in any generation. The fifth chapter will be Errol Hulse's appraisal of Andrew Fuller. He says Fuller's theology was soundly scriptural and sanely balanced. And the sixth and final chapter will be Michael Haken's appraisal of Andrew Fuller. He says the fire of revival that fell upon Fuller was given form and shape by the orthodoxy of John Gill. So, those will be the chapter headings under which I've arranged my thoughts for this episode. However, given the length of the introduction, it's probably a good time for us to take our first break. And when we return, I'll be giving to you my own appraisal of Andrew Fuller from a historical perspective. I'll see you in a few minutes. I'd like to welcome you back. For this first chapter, I'd like to share with you my appraisal of Andrew Fuller from a historical perspective. And as I mentioned during the introduction, I call my appraisal a non-reformed analysis, not because I reject the tenets of Calvinism, but because I reject the tenets of moderate Calvinism, which is represented by today's Reformed movement. I'm a historic hyper-Calvinist, and I'm aligned with the teachings of the particular Baptists. Let me begin by making reference to the previous couple of episodes where I spoke about the modern definition for hyper-Calvinism. Having distinguished between the moderate and hyper-Calvinist theological frameworks, I've attempted to demonstrate how the modern definition for hyper-Calvinism is based on the moderate Calvinist theological framework, and therefore that which they impute to hyper-Calvinists is actually a projection of their own struggles and fears, desperately trying to maintain a balance between what they call the contradiction between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. It's not a definition, however, based on the actual theological framework embraced by hyper-Calvinists. One must therefore exercise great caution when listening to the moderate Calvinists opine on hyper-Calvinism. They know neither what they say nor whereof they affirm when it comes to this subject. In any case, these theological frameworks, I've argued, may be traced as far back to the 17th and 18th centuries, with reputable theologians subscribing to one or the other of these doctrinal positions. Nehemiah Cox, for instance, took a view similar to that of moderate Calvinism, which is reflected in the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. Benjamin Keach and Joseph Hussey, on the other hand, they took a very different view from that of Cox and the 1689 Confession, embracing views similar to that of hyper-Calvinism. These differing views then broke out into several public controversies throughout the 18th century. Men such as Matthias Morris, Abraham Taylor, and Alvary Jackson, they defended the moderate Calvinist theological framework, whereas men such as Louis Wayman, John Brine, and John Johnson, they defended the hyper-Calvinist theological framework. For every pamphlet printed by the moderate Calvinists, the hyper-Calvinists responded in kind. The debate between these men reached a kind of stalemate during the 1750s, with neither side making much advancement against the other. And I suspect a large reason for this was that neither side properly understood the theological framework of the other. Or rather, neither side accurately dealt with the duty, faith, and free offer issues by addressing the subject from the standpoint of the other side. Each side, generally speaking, just dug into its own theological framework, making its case for or against the doctrines of duty, faith, and the free offer in accordance with its own way of understanding things. As a result, little room was allowed for bringing the issues to the table for a proper and thorough examination of the controversy. But even then, if we're honest about the situation, if the two sides did sit at the table and clearly outline their theological systems, it's unlikely either side would have changed positions. It would have become what it ultimately became, a stalemate within the particular Baptist denomination, a policy of agreeing to disagree. And that, of course, is precisely what the churches did. They remained a single denomination throughout the 18th century, agreeing to disagree on these issues. Things, however, did not continue this way for long. A young man named Andrew Fuller entered the controversy during the 1780s. But, unlike his predecessors, Fuller developed the moderate Calvinist theological framework into a systematic theology which in some ways checkmated the hyper-Calvinists with regards to the duty faith and free offer issues. That is, Fuller did with the moderate Calvinist theological framework what his forefathers never dared attempt. He introduced a number of modifications, not only to the basic tenets of Calvinism, but also to that of Christianity. You see, these doctrines, duty faith and the free offer, they were, for Fuller, the most important teachings of the Christian faith. Everything must conform to these doctrines. And if that meant modifying the basic tenets of Calvinism and undermining or denying Orthodox Christianity, he was willing to make those sacrifices, so long as he could defend the doctrines of duty faith and the free offer. It was in this way, having developed an entirely new systematic theology, that Fuller was able to argue in a more aggressive manner and with a greater number of arguments for the doctrines of duty faith and the free offer. You see, up until that time, the moderate Calvinists restricted themselves to the parameters of the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. They never dreamt of modifying the Christian faith in order to accommodate the duty faith and free offer teachings. This, of course, greatly limited or restricted their defense of duty faith and the free offer, which in turn, and on some level, gave to the hyper-Calvinists a decided advantage in the debate. But now, with Fuller opening the gates of Calvinism to be more inclusive of Arminianism, as well as the gates of Christianity to be more inclusive of liberalism, a far greater array of arguments for the duty faith and free offer teachings could be set forth. And this completely changed the dynamics of the 18th century controversy. It took the hyper-Calvinists by storm, by surprise. It pushed them on their heels. The hyper-Calvinists never expected they would be put into a position of having to defend not only the tenets of hyper-Calvinism, but also the fundamental articles of Christianity. And what added complexity to the situation was that Fuller made his new arguments guised in the form of what he called strict or true Calvinism and Orthodox Christianity. And it was for this reason the hyper-Calvinists called Fuller a wolf in sheep's clothing, a false prophet who was coming into the churches to spy out the liberty they had in Christ. They called him an impostor whose teachings were making havoc of the flock of God while claiming to be an angel of light. In fact, he was a minister of darkness. And it was also for this reason many moderate Calvinists also stood against the teachings of Fuller. men such as Abraham Booth, because they realized, along with the hyper-Calvinists, that what Fuller was introducing to the churches was something that had never been taught before, at least within the particular Baptist denomination. And yet, so desperate were the moderate Calvinists to gain a foothold in their battle against the hyper-Calvinists, they eventually welcomed Fuller's contribution to the debate, happy to adopt his new system of teachings, as they came to see how it could turn the tide of victory in their favor. And sure enough, a victory they gained. For the vast majority of the particular Baptist churches were carried away with what became known as Fullerism. I remind you, the particular Baptist churches remained a single denomination between the years 1633 and 1785. For the first 90 years or thereabouts, the mainstream view was that of moderate Calvinism, between the years 1633 and, let's say, 1720. For the next 70 to 80 years or so, between the years 1720, let's say 1785, maybe the year 1800, the mainstream view was that of hyper-Calvinism. And yet, throughout the course of these years, the two sides agreed to disagree. They remained a single denomination. It wasn't until Andrew Fuller published his book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, in the year 1785, that the churches began to split into two distinct denominations. Those who followed the theological teachings of John Gill became known as the hyper-Calvinists, whereas those who followed the theological teachings of Andrew Fuller became known as moderate Calvinists. Now, please consider this division or split did not happen suddenly. It was a slow, protracted, and steady split. It began in the year 1785, and I believe there's evidence that shows it culminating around the year 1820. And that is then a 30-year period of an ecclesiastical war within the particular Baptist denomination. However, in the early days of this split, soon after Fuller published his book and within that 15-year time period, it caused a great stir and awesome opposition, great opposition among the particular Baptist denomination. And for that matter, many others outside the particular Baptist denomination. Reputable men from all camps stood against Fuller's teachings. I've already referenced the moderate Calvinists, men such as Abraham Booth. This man was best known for publishing a book on sovereign grace almost 20 years before Fuller published his book. Booth's book was called The Reign of Grace. It was published in 1768, and he was also considered a reputable theologian within the particular Baptist denomination. Booth was a moderate Calvinist, but he was a traditional moderate Calvinist, throwing back to the 1689 Confession. A different type of moderate Calvinist than that of Andrew Fuller, who modified the 1689 Confession. Well, it was towards the turn of the 19th century that Abraham Booth published a couple of other books, both of which denounced several modifications Fuller had made to the gospel of Christ. In particular, the doctrines of the atonement, redemption, and justification. But then, in addition to the moderate Calvinists, those who supposedly were in the same camp as Andrew Fuller, even the Arminian Baptists turned against Fuller, with men such as Dan Taylor writing in opposition. And of course, Fuller's greatest opposition came from the hyper-Calvinists, men such as William Button, John Martin, John Stevens, William Rushton, William Garrard, Job Hupton, and John Foreman. And you see, while the moderate Calvinists, such as Abraham Booth, and the hyper-Calvinists, such as William Button, disagreed with each other on the doctrines of duty, faith, and the free offer, yet they were united in their opposition to the modifications Fuller had made to the Christian faith. And that's important for you to mark down, my dear friend. There was a time early on, after Fuller published his book, that the hyper-Calvinists and moderate Calvinists stood shoulder to shoulder against the modifications Fuller was making to the Christian faith. And it was this, the modifications Fuller made to the Christian faith, that ultimately split the particular Baptist churches into two denominations. However, this split is often attributed by moderate Calvinists to Fuller's opposition to the duty, faith, and free offer issues. They argue the hyper-Calvinists didn't like Fuller or his teachings because he defended duty, faith, and the free offer and evangelism, and therefore the church is split over those issues. But that, my dear friends, is not true. While the duty, faith, and free offer issues were factors that led to the split, the straw which broke the camel's back, as it were, was Fuller's modifications to Orthodox Christianity. After all, remember, for 100 years between 1707 and 1803, the particular Baptist churches remained a single denomination, although they disputed with each other over the duty, faith, and free offer issues. We must therefore ask, if these were the only issues which caused the churches to divide during the days of Fuller, why didn't it divide the churches far sooner, since the debate over these issues had been ongoing for decades? The answer, of course, the churches did not divide over these particular issues, but rather they divided over that set of teachings which became known as Fullerism, which was in essence an amalgamation of Arminianism with Calvinism and a repudiation of several fundamental articles of the Christian faith. And yet today, when one hears of Andrew Fuller, he's touted as the greatest theologian of the 17th and 18th centuries, more orthodox in the faith than that of John Gill. Indeed, many believe Fuller was the true stalwart of the faith, the man who not only single-handedly saved the particular Baptist churches from hyper-Calvinism, but a man who stood tall on the fundamentals of the Christian faith, promoting and defending the articles of the 1689 Baptist Confession. But these things simply aren't true, my dear friend. And I'm not speaking here as a partisan. Even the most ardent supporters of Fuller today grudgingly admit that his teachings, at the very least, suggest a modification of several fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith. I'll give you an example of this. I just read for the second time Robert Oliver's book on the 18th and 19th century particular Baptist history. He's inserted in the second appendix of his book a short defense of Andrew Fuller's teachings, attempting to exonerate him of heresy. It's truly a weak and pathetic attempt on his part, and perhaps in a future episode I'll talk about that in more detail. But for now, I only mention this because even Oliver, in his defense of Fullerism, was forced to admit that there are many things in his writings which suggests he departed from the faith. But of course, Oliver and his moderate friends don't concede that Fuller departed from the faith, yet they acknowledge the reader may easily interpret Fuller in that way. It's therefore necessary, if one is to find the truth of the matter, to read Fuller for oneself, that an accurate appraisal may be made of his teachings. And you see, this is not only what I've done, I've read his works, but in the next 2 or 3 episodes, I'll be diagramming Fuller's systematic theology, reading for you extensive passages from his works, that you may see for yourself what it was he taught, after which you'll be able to exercise your own judgment and make your own appraisal on the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. But listen, having mentioned Oliver and his book, it's only proper that I warn you. If you're inclined to read it, take his interpretation of history and theology with a bowl of salt. Not a grain of salt, a bowl of salt. They say don't read a book by its cover. Well, in this case, in my view, the cover is the best part of his book. He doesn't understand the theological framework of hyper-Calvinism, and therefore his entire analysis of the particular Baptist churches and their gospel witness is twisted and misrepresented. And this is most surprising, since it's my understanding he grew up in churches which supposedly subscribed to hyper-Calvinism. One would therefore suspect that he was in a good position to know the theological framework of the churches under which he was raised. But you see, this just may be one of the main reasons Oliver forsook his upbringing and became an outspoken opponent of his childhood churches. It's because he never understood the teachings that were instilled throughout his childhood. Ironically, it was for that same reason Andrew Fuller forsook the hyper-Calvinism of his upbringing. He too never understood the theological framework of hyper-Calvinism. Let this serve as a warning to you, my friend. Be sure, if you're going to oppose the tenets of hyper-Calvinism, you do so on the basis of its teachings, rather than that imputed to it by the blind and ignorant. All right, well, this is my appraisal of Andrew Fuller from a historical perspective, and as I've said, I'll be giving to you my appraisal of Fuller from a theological perspective in the upcoming episodes. But this brings us then to the end of the first chapter of this episode, and time for another break. When we return, we'll consider the way in which Jack Hode appraised the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. and I'll then give to you my response to Hode's view. I'll see you in a few minutes. I'd like to welcome you back. I hope you've enjoyed your break. I have. In our previous chapter, I presented to you my appraisal of Andrew Fuller from a historical perspective. For this chapter, I like to examine Jack Hode's appraisal of Fuller. In essence, he says Fuller's teachings, espoused in his book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, was God's instrument for founding world missions. Now, before I begin this chapter, I warn you, I have a lot of thoughts to share, and therefore I suspect this chapter may be disproportionately longer than the others. The reason for this will be made known as I introduce you to the man. Jack Hode was a highly respected Reformed Baptist preacher, one of the pioneers of the Reformed Baptist movement. He took a lead role in the Grace Baptist Association and affiliated groups. Needless to say, therefore, he was a classic moderate Calvinist. Surprisingly, I couldn't locate an online photo of him. Now, I'm sure I have various photos in my box of old albums, but I don't currently have access to those boxes. The only digital copy I could find is the one you see on the screen. He was a close family friend. I therefore knew him from a young age. After I was called to preach in the mid-1990s, he actually became one of my mentors. You see, rather than receiving my ministerial training through a Bible school, I opted to sit under the private mentorship of various pastors and professors, kind of like Paul sitting at the feet of Gamaliel, and therefore I sat under the instructions of Jack Hode, including an in-depth study of his book on Baptist history. It was only natural, therefore, when I was ordained to the gospel ministry, that Jack Hode joined the Ordination Council, which is the occasion for the photo, with his hands on my shoulder, whispering words of counsel and bringing us before the throne of grace. I was actually ordained twice in two parts of the world, because I had so many mentors under which I sat. They had to be divided according to their geographical locations. Hode joined the Ordination Council in London, and it was this chapel, the one you see on the screen, where I served as pastor for the next 20 years. This is actually a historic, strict and particular Baptist chapel with an important and fascinating history. Perhaps in an upcoming episode I'll talk a little bit about its history and significance. But look, I have to say I'm thankful this is the only photo I could find of Hode, because it gives me the opportunity to say something important at this juncture of the episode, and for that matter, of this podcast as a whole. Hode was a gracious man. I endeared myself to him as a grandson to a grandfather. And although I've come to disagree with him theologically and historically, I remain thankful to have been given the opportunity to know him. And I want you to know, therefore, the critiques I'm about to make with regards to his theology and history, they're not personal attacks. I carry no animosity in my heart towards Jack Hode, or for that matter, any of these men and women I've critiqued in the first few episodes, or will critique in the episodes to come. I have nothing against them personally. In fact, having met quite a few of the leading Reformed Baptists over the last 30 to 40 years, I can't remember one encounter that was unpleasant. They have all handled themselves within a social context, professionally, and with much courtesy and charm. And I would hope if ever my path were to cross with such persons in the future, we would be able to share a meal and enjoy a coffee together, blessed by our fellowship in Christ, yet not afraid to speak of our differences. I don't think, my dear friends, in situations of this kind, when we have believers who take different views on doctrinal points, I don't think it's helpful for the two sides to be disagreeable, although they disagree. It's possible to converse on matters without devolving into petty arguments and feeding into a spirit of contention. Now, I know it's not always possible to avoid that type of unpleasant encounter, and sometimes people with the best intentions stumble. I have in my own interactions with people many times over. I'm sure you have as well. But surely the guiding principle for all believers should be that which Paul himself gave: if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. And so I believe that should govern the type of interactions between believers. Having said that, this doesn't mean believers don't state their views and take firm stands on their convictions. I think of Paul again, who had to withstand Peter to the face because he was to be blamed. But you see, that encounter didn't turn the two men against each other. Many years later, when Peter wrote his letters, he mentioned Paul in his letters, having nothing negative to say about Paul personally. Only that Paul's teachings were deep and sometimes hard to understand, which I suppose on some level may be taken as a minor criticism as well as a compliment. Now, I hope you'll therefore understand that as I critique the teachings of Jack Code and others, I must withstand them because I believe they are to be blamed. And likewise, these men would no doubt withstand me because they believe I am to be blamed. You see, we stand on either side of this divide, each side believing it is right, because each side understands history and theology in a very different way. Well then, let's look at Andrew Fuller from the side on which Jack Code stood. In the year 1986, he published a book on Baptist history called The Baptist. On page 120, he gave the following appraisal of Fuller's teachings and legacy. I'm going to read for you the quote as a whole, and then I'll come back to the top and I'd like to give my response to it. Jack Code wrote, Fuller remained a Calvinist and repudiated both Arminianism and Socinianism. This book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, made an immeasurable impact upon the particular Baptists, awakened their responsibility to proclaim the gospel to all who will hear it, and paved the way for evangelical Calvinism, which was to be God's instrument for the founding of modern world missions. It had other effects too, principally in hardening the creed of those who disagreed. As I said, I like to respond from the top, and I'll take his first sentence. Fuller remained a Calvinist and repudiated the Arminianism, repudiated Arminianism and Socinianism. Yes, this of course is the mainstream narrative and belief. They say Andrew Fuller was a strict Calvinist or true Calvinist, because that's how Andrew Fuller identified himself in his writings. Therefore, if Fuller called himself a true or strict Calvinist, that settles it. He must have been a true Calvinist. And if you're at all doubtful of this, then just consider Fuller was an advocate for the doctrines of duty, faith, and free offer, There, you see, he was a true Calvinist. He was entirely orthodox in the faith. And because Fuller wrote against Arminianism and Socinianism, so this is further proof that he wasn't an Arminian or a Socinian. Now, that tends to be the attitude of moderate Calvinists when it comes to an appraisal of Fuller's teachings. Their appraisal isn't based on the actual writings of Fuller on these topics. It's not based on what Fuller taught about Calvinism or Arminianism or Socinianism. No. 97% of moderate Calvinists, that's my estimate, they have no time to read what Fuller actually wrote on these matters. It's enough for them to see a snippet from his writings, that he called himself a true Calvinist, and boom, that's it. That's sufficient. That's what he was. It's enough for them to know he subscribed to the doctrines of duty, faith, and the free offer. Boom, that's it. He must have therefore been entirely balanced and orthodox in his theology. It's enough for them to peruse the table of contents of his works, to see he wrote somewhat extensively on the subjects of Arminianism and Socinianism, and boom, that's it. He repudiated those systems of teachings. Now you see, they haven't actually read Fuller on these subjects. They've just read the book by its cover, as it were, taking comfort that they've done enough research to confirm the mainstream view, promoted by men such as Jack Code. Fuller remained a Calvinist and repudiated Arminianism and Socinianism. The problem is, my dear friends, when one actually begins reading through the works of Fuller, the very opposite is discovered. While Fuller maintained certain aspects of Calvinism or free grace, it was mixed with other aspects of Arminianism or free will, thus creating what many have identified as Calminianism, the amalgamation of Calvinism with Arminianism. And it's for that reason, when we read through various historical treatises, written even by moderate Calvinists, they will often refer to Fuller's teachings as a modification of Calvinism, although they either don't explain what they mean by that expression, or else they explain it away as non-essential to the grand scheme of historical and biblical theology. But you see, Fuller's modifications to Calvinism meant that he was neither a Calvinist in the proper sense of the term, nor did he repudiate Arminianism in the proper sense of that term. Yet Jack Code wants to make Andrew Fuller the standard for all orthodoxy. He wants us to believe that Fuller sharpened the edge of Calvinism rather than blunting it. As for Socinianism, it's actually quite ironic that although Fuller wrote against that system of teaching, yet there's much in his writings which give clear overtures to it, thus making his doctrinal positions a self-imposed contradiction. But as I've mentioned in the last few episodes, self-imposed contradictions is one of the hallmarks of moderate Calvinism, of which Fullerism is an extension. They love their doctrinal contradictions, touting them as the clearest evidence for the legitimacy of their truth claims. But watch, Hode continues. He says, this book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, made an immeasurable impact upon the particular Baptists, awakening their responsibility to proclaim the gospel to all who hear it. This is another mainstream narrative created and propagated by the moderate Calvinists. They say, because the particular Baptist churches fell into hyper-Calvinism throughout the first half of the 18th century, evangelism was neglected and the church faced an existential threat. If the churches continued in their hyper-Calvinism, then the whole denomination would have been lost with chapel closures. Hyper-Calvinism, they say, is a doctrine from hell. Yes, many have said that, because they argue it forbids the proclamation of the gospel to all who will hear it. And even if some hear it, hyper-Calvinism prohibits sinners from exercising faith in Christ. And they say, if that doesn't frighten you away from their teachings, then remember, a lot of hyper-Calvinists deny the Ten Commandments as the rule of conduct for the believer's life. They therefore turn the grace of God into a license to sin, believing they can live any way they please because God's grace is greater than sin. That's hyper-Calvinism, they say. And that's the terrible condition, they argue, into which the majority of particular Baptist churches fell during the 18th century. And they continue to argue it's within that context God sent a prophet. He sent a deliverer. He sent a savior, a Messiah, to rescue the churches from destruction. That savior was Andrew Fuller. And by the sword of his mighty book, the gospel worthy of all acceptation, he restored the particular Baptists to their former glory, igniting a spirit of evangelism and sparking a denominational-wide revival of conversions and baptisms. However, they don't fully acknowledge this split actually occurred within the particular Baptist denomination. When I say this split, I'm talking about, if you look at the on-screen notes, I'm talking about the white horizontal line running between the churches after the year 1785. Moderate Calvinists either play down this split or outright reject it. They don't accept that the church is split in this way. Rather, they believe the churches remained a single mainstream denomination, represented by moderate Calvinism, and that while there continued to be some churches that maintained hyper-Calvinism, yet it was only a fringe group, deviants from true Calvinism, certainly not large enough to represent the particular Baptist denomination as a whole, and therefore they're relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of particular Baptist history. It's on this basis moderate Calvinists don't pay much attention to these churches, and they also feel at liberty to twist historical facts, which moves everything into the favor of their doctrinal bias, that of moderate Calvinism. Henceforth, they say the Reformed Baptists today are the heirs of this particular Baptist heritage, that they are the continuation of this unbroken line of true Calvinism, which reaches back through Andrew Fuller to the 1689 Baptist Confession. They believe they are therefore standing with Fuller on the principles of his strict Calvinism, duty faith, and free offer teachings, and Christian orthodoxy. Now you see, that's the narrative Jack Code taught me personally. Aside from the things he put in his book, in addition to that, he taught me these things about hyper-Calvinism. He cast Andrew Fuller and his teachings under the most brilliant light of so-called true orthodoxy and Calvinism. Hode told me that Fuller became one of the greatest evangelical leaders of the 18th century. And you know, I was taught these things by Hode when I was still a teenager, while training for the gospel ministry. And it was for that reason, during the first 10 years of my pastoral ministry, I nurtured deep prejudices against hyper-Calvinism and those who subscribe to what is called hyper-Calvinism. And Hode presented those teachings as something that was plunged up from the pit of hell. He warned me against them. I didn't even want to own the books or subscribe to the magazines of hyper-Calvinists. But I don't know if I was more angry at them for their heresy or fearful of them. I mean, I certainly didn't want to condone their heresies. I was angry at that. But I also didn't want to be confused by their heresies, and that caused me to fear them, to fear their teachings. So the safest policy was to stay away from them. And you see, all of that anger and fear had been nurtured in my mind and heart, largely through the training I received from Jack Hode. He was the one who instilled that type of thinking in me. Now, not all of his teachings were bad. Another mentor of mine named Ken Connolly, he always taught me never to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so there is much that Jack Hode instilled in me that to this day I embrace and I very much appreciate. But on this particular subject of hyper-Calvinism, I'm saying to you, he's the one that put these prejudices into my mind and heart. Of course, he wasn't the only one I heard these things from, because I belonged at the time to the moderate Calvinist circle of teachings. So this was the narrative, generally speaking, that everybody held. I'm talking here now about something very important: prejudice and bigotry. Something I'm admitting to shamefully that I nurtured in my heart against hyper-Calvinists in my earlier part of the ministry. It's a terrible thing, my friend. A terrible thing to have bigotry and prejudice nurtured in the heart. I was taught to understand theology and history in a way that promoted that type of thinking. Now, I don't believe this is how theology and history should be interpreted today, but I certainly believed it at the time. And I can't help but imagine perhaps you're watching this episode and you too have had bad ideas presented to you as it relates to hyper-Calvinism. And you have also been nurturing prejudices and biases and bigotry towards the hyper-Calvinists. Oh, my friend, don't you want to be relieved of those negative thoughts and feelings? You can be. Knowledge is power, they say. And a knowledge of hyper-Calvinism, what it is they actually believe and teach, it will free you from your prejudices and your biases and your bigotry. I promise you that. It doesn't mean you'll agree with the hyper-Calvinists. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, if you can understand what it is they actually believe and teach, you won't be so angry with them. You won't fear them so much. In fact, you'll come to appreciate a lot that they teach and have taught over the years. They have a rich history and heritage, and their writings have been lost because of the bigotry that has now dominated the religious scene of our day. So I encourage you, my friend, don't be afraid to examine these teachings. I'm glad you're watching this podcast and following this episode. I hope you'll come to have a clear understanding of what it is Hyper-Calvinists teach and believe, and that you'll be able to be gone with all of those negative feelings in your heart. It's a wonderful thing to be free from those types of feelings. But look, let me continue with what Hode writes. He then says that this paved the way for evangelical Calvinism. Fuller's book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, says Hode, paved the way for what he calls evangelical Calvinism. Anyone who is familiar with these things will know the teachings of Andrew Fuller have come to be known either as Fullerism or evangelical Calvinism. This expression is one of those crafty uses of language where error is dressed in truth. By prefixing evangelical to Calvinism, the idea is conveyed that Fullerism promotes the proclamation of the gospel, whereas Hyper-Calvinism prohibits the proclamation of the gospel. But as I mentioned a few moments ago, Hyper-Calvinism does not prohibit the proclamation of the gospel. There is not one example throughout the course of history of Hyper-Calvinists prohibiting the proclamation of the gospel to all sinners. Not one example. Go ahead, my friend. Give it a try. Look into the annals of history. Read the church records of the Hyper-Calvinist congregations. Study the sermons and writings of the Hyper-Calvinists. Not one has ever prohibited the proclamation of the gospel. Nor has one prohibited poor and needy sinners from coming freely to Christ to find relief for their souls. Not one. And yet, Jack Hode and his moderate friends have very subtly and artfully so framed the teachings of Fuller as to convey this idea that Fullerism is right because it proclaims the gospel to all sinners, whereas Hyper-Calvinism is wrong because it prohibits the gospel from reaching sinners. They say Fullerism is evangelical Calvinism, whereas Hyper-Calvinism, not evangelical Calvinism. You see, this is a slippery use of language designed to hoodwink the simple and the ignorant. It deceived me for the first part of my gospel ministry. You'll remember in Romans chapter 16, Paul spoke about marking those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which they had learned, and to avoid them. He said, "Such are they who by good words and fair speeches deceive the hearts of the simple." And that, my dear friends, is what we find here with the use of this type of language. They are good and crafty words. They're fair and cunning speeches designed to nurture prejudice and bigotry against Hyper-Calvinism. Having said this, let me make a comment about the use of these terms, evangelical and Calvinism. By Calvinism, one expects it to reference the soteriological views of the Synod of Dort, summarized under the 5 points of Calvinism. Well, one will discover when reading the works of Fuller that he modified at least 4, and maybe even all 5 points of Calvinism, insomuch that they do not resemble the Calvinism found in the 17th century confessional statements. Henceforth, it's yet another crafty use of language to identify Fuller with so-called true Calvinism, or what he called strict Calvinism, when his teachings had made such significant modifications to the Synod of Dort and the 17th century confessional statements. As for the term evangelical, it may be understood in one of two ways, neither of which accurately identifies the teachings of Fuller. First, if used as an adjective, then it's describing Calvinism as evangelistic, or a Calvinism which preaches the gospel to all sinners. However, that was not the point and focus of Fuller's teachings. Fuller did not argue for the proclamation of the gospel to all sinners. There was no argument or disagreement between Fuller and the hyper-Calvinists on that point. All of them believed the gospel should be proclaimed to all sinners. Rather, Fuller argued for the proffer of life and salvation to sinners, which, as I've explained in the previous episodes, equates to proselyting rather than evangelism. Henceforth, the more accurate term would be proselyting Calvinism rather than evangelical Calvinism. But second, this term evangelical, if used as a noun, then it's identifying Christian orthodoxy with Calvinism. For when we use the term evangelical as a noun, we're referring to the basic tenets of the Christian faith. Well, even in this sense, it cannot be used of Fuller's theology. For there were several fundamental articles of the Christian faith Fuller modified or denied, and therefore the better label for Fullerism would be modified evangelicalism. And you see, it's for this reason. If ever you read the writings of George Ella, he repeatedly says of Andrew Fuller, his teachings were neither evangelical or Calvinistic. But Jack Coad has an entirely different view on these matters. He believed Fuller represented the Christian faith and the basic tenets of 17th century Calvinism. I must say, I'm thankful to the Lord to be on the other side of this controversy, because having read Fuller for myself, I could not defend his teachings as Hode has done here. But now watch. Hode continues. He writes of Fuller's book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation. He says that book was to be God's instrument for the founding of modern world missions. Now, Hode accredits Fuller's book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, as the instrument which founded the modern missions movement. Of course, what Hode means by the modern missions movement is global outreach on an industrial scale. Global outreach on an industrial scale. Some have compared it to the evangelistic endeavors of the Apostle Paul, who, as you know, traveled from country to country throughout the Roman Empire, preaching the gospel and organizing churches. I suppose, therefore, if that were true, a comparison between what Paul did and what Andrew Fuller and William Carey did within the context of the 18th century, then one would have to also argue that Paul would be that of Fuller, a moderate Calvinist, whereas the other apostles would be that of the hyper-Calvinists? For I ask you, how many of the other apostles traveled the Roman Empire, duplicating Paul's evangelistic campaigns? They didn't. It was a singular work of the Apostle Paul. But you see, we know that this is a ridiculous analogy. To take the context of the 18th century, the controversy between the hyper-Calvinist and the moderate Calvinist, that simplistic position taken by the moderate Calvinist. They say, well, the moderate Calvinist went to the world with the gospel, modern missions movement, whereas the hyper-Calvinists were against it because they didn't believe in evangelism. And then they compare it to the New Testament with Paul's evangelistic endeavors. And to be true to the analogy, they must therefore admit also that the 11 apostles that didn't join Paul on his evangelistic endeavors, they must have been hyper-Calvinists. But it's all ridiculous, is it not? Just because Paul traveled to other countries with the gospel, compared to the other apostles who remained local to Judea, generally speaking, it doesn't mean Paul was therefore balanced in his theology and had an evangelistic zeal, whereas the others were imbalanced and lacked an evangelistic zeal. But that's the type of thinking which drives and inspires the moderate Calvinists within our modern context. They take great pride in world missions, thinking this proves they have a balanced theology, igniting great evangelistic zeal and urgency, while spurning the hyper-Calvinists as having an imbalanced theology, with no evangelistic zeal or urgency, simply because they didn't invent world missions or jump on the bandwagon with the Fullerites. But my dear friends, there are many reasons why the modern missionary movement was invented, and although it's presented very often as a spiritual and biblical renewal, that is not the singular, nor may I even say the main reason why the modern missionary movement was invented. In fact, there were many factors which caused the hyper-Calvinists to resist the modern missions movement. I like to highlight just a few of them. First and foremost, they were Englishmen, living at a time when the British Empire was reaching its golden age of colonial power. By British Empire, I mean England's colonial period when at its zenith colonized 25% of the globe. It was the largest empire in the history of the world. It was said, I believe, during the reign of Queen Victoria, that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because she had subjugated under her rule nations from all corners of the world. In 1763, the East India Company won the Battle of Plassey, establishing military and political control in India. In 1783, the American colonies won their independence, which then shifted England's interests from America to other parts of the world. In the same year, England gained vast new territories in India as the result of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War. And then, between 1783 and 1914, England continued to add to her empire, all of which turned the eyes of Englishmen to the world. Now, one cannot possibly interpret the rise of the modern missionary enterprise correctly without taking into consideration the national and geographical context of the day in which Fuller and Carey lived. What is almost always presented as singularly spiritual and biblical renewal of evangelism was actually a mixture of many factors, some of which were spiritual and biblical, but many others which were products of the time in which these men lived. I mean, if government was sending political and military assets to these far-reaching colonies of the globe, and if businesses were following suit, setting up new headquarters around the world, then why should not Christians jump on the bandwagon and organize churches in those places? You see, the modern missionary enterprise was not a reaction against hyper-Calvinism. It was a reaction to British colonialism. And it's for that reason the modern missions enterprise has almost invariably been structured around parachurch organizations rather than driven by local church endeavors. Reaching the world, you see, is far too large a work for one church. So churches unite. They have to organize societies and mission boards. They have to combine their resources. And then those societies and mission boards commission preachers and workers, sending them around the globe as missionaries. These preachers and workers, however, rather than representing Christ, or even the local church that sends them, they become representatives of that society, of that mission board. Because those societies and mission board control the purse, the money, and are often the ones doing the sending. Yes, I have to say, it's a business model that's proven to work practically and successfully, at least from a pragmatic and business point of view. But one must ask, is this the evangelistic model one finds recorded in the New Testament scriptures? No, not really. And yet Jack Hode, with his moderate Calvinist circle, extols the modern missionary enterprise as a return to New Testament Christianity, anointing men such as Fuller and Carey with apostolic unction. But the evangelistic campaigns of the Apostle Paul certainly don't resemble the modern missionary enterprise brought into existence by Carey and Fuller. Yet how many today are asking the important question, does the end justify the means? You see, who would ever condemn sending well-meaning missionaries around the world? Look at all the good they do, we're told. And so the means on getting them to the field is overlooked. It doesn't matter. So long as the end is achieved, we don't have to concern ourselves with the path that gets us there. And that tends to be the attitude of the modern missionary enterprise. And as for the gospel that's preached, well, so long as they talk about the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, together with the obligation for the unconverted to exercise saving faith, and life and salvation is proffered to them with many tears and pleadings, then that's sufficient. Anyone who brings a message like that to the foreign field is commended with high praise. Of course, part of the problem with this so-called gospel message is that not only is this the message of Arminianism and moderate Calvinism, but it's even the message of Romanism, together with the wide range of cults. All of these groups preach the death, burial, resurrection of Christ, together with a duty-faith gospel and proffers of life and salvation. There's absolutely nothing in that message that distinguishes it apart from all other professing Christian religions. But you see, that's the evangelistic or proselyting message of Andrew Fuller. That's the evangelistic or proselyting message of Fullerism. And these were some of the things, I say, that didn't sit well with the hyper-Calvinists of Fuller's day. It wasn't because they were against sending gospel preachers to the vast outposts of the world. It was because it was something that had never been done before on that scale. And given the context of British colonialism, they were cautious before making such a venture without considering the costs, without considering the biblical parameters around which such an endeavor should be employed. They were especially concerned with this whole notion of parachurch organization and turning the work of an evangelist into a business model. For these hyper-Calvinists, especially those belonging to the strict Baptists, they were local churchmen. They were local churchmen believing all Christian activity should be conducted within the context of a local church. But more than this, the hyper-Calvinists were fighting heresy on every side, and now that Fuller had written his book, they were fighting it within their own ranks. Fuller set forth a gospel not only different from that of hyper-Calvinism, but different from that of 17th century confessional statements. It was for that reason, early on after Fuller's publication of his book, both moderate and hyper-Calvinists stood against him. And you see, the hyper-Calvinists were reluctant to support Fuller's evangelistic or proselyting endeavors because they believed he was propagating a false gospel. Just like the Reformed Baptists today, they don't support the evangelistic endeavors of Arminian churches. They believe Arminian churches are propagating a false gospel. And yet, while this is precisely why the hyper-Calvinists didn't support the modern missions movement during the days of Fuller and Carey, the Reformed Baptists today don't grant that same privilege to the hyper-Calvinists of Fuller's day. Say it's okay for the Reformed Baptists to not support the proselyting endeavors of the Arminians, but it's not okay for the hyper-Calvinists not to support the proselyting endeavors of the Fullerites. It's all hypocrisy, I say. While the Reformed Baptists assume certain privileges to themselves, they don't grant those same privileges to the hyper-Calvinists, and on the same token, they then condemn the hyper-Calvinists as being anti-evangelical. Well, you may be familiar with the popular story of William Carey, who, attending the Nottinghamshire Association in 1785, proposed the pastors in attendance of that meeting discuss the duty of Christians to spread the gospel among the nations. A 62-year-old hyper-Calvinist preacher named John Ryland reportedly told the young man to shut up and sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he'll do it without your aid or mine. Now, it's actually questionable whether this incident even took place, because the first time it's recorded, if I remember correctly, was around 30 years after the event, which means the witnesses of the event were removed and not able to either refute or affirm it. Nevertheless, let's say the incident did occur. Then one must take into consideration the larger context into which the incident fits. The rebuke was not against the mandate to preach the gospel to every creature. Ryland and the hyper-Calvinists firmly believed the gospel should be preached to every creature. Nor was the opposition against taking the gospel to foreign lands. In principle, they were not against that either. But rather, their concern was this: how should the gospel be taken to foreign lands? And once the missionaries get there, what gospel should be preached. You see, the content preached by the evangelist was of far greater importance to the hyper-Calvinists than the number of evangelists that could be sent to foreign fields with a gospel other than that of free grace. And you see, it would have been that which was the greatest concern to John Ryland when he told Carey to sit down and shut up. No amount of proselyting will add one soul to the kingdom of God. However, in addition to this, there was no doubt also a personal element to the incident. Apparently, William Carey, who was only a young man at the time, had done several things to upset the churches of this association, not least of which was straddling the fence between denominations. Henceforth, when the young man appeared at the meeting with elder pastors present, it was highly suspicious, not a bit presumptuous, that this outsider, and but a novice in the ministry, should assume such authority or audacity, dictating the agenda of the meeting to his elder preachers. Now, I say these things to push back against this narrative created by the moderate Calvinists, that the hyper-Calvinists rejected evangelism and were even against taking the gospel to foreign lands. That's simply not true. It's nothing other than propaganda. In fact, although most of the hyper-Calvinist churches had nothing to do with Fuller's missionary movement, do you know there were actually some pastors and hyper-Calvinist churches which contributed financially to the work and offered their approval of the larger endeavors of the movement? But of course, sitting now in the year 2026, we have the advantage, living in the 21st century, to look back at this history and judge whether certain endeavors prove to be good or bad. In the case of the modern missionary movement, I believe it's long overdue that we take a proper look at that history and to pass judgment on whether or not it was intrinsically good or bad. And therefore, to that end, our attention, of course, must be given to the particular Baptist Missionary Society. This was Fuller's Society, started in 1792. The Arminians started a similar society 25 years later, in 1816. And around 70 years after that, the two societies joined together in the year 1891. You see, the teachings of Fuller, which were the basis for the particular Baptist Missionary Society, having been a mixture of Calvinism with Arminianism, it flung open its doors to Arminianism throughout the 19th century, insomuch that it ceased to exist as a sovereign grace missionary society by the end of the 19th century. And then, when the Reformed Baptist movement emerged during the 1950s, it's assumed by many that they restored the society to its original Fullerite position. But that isn't what they did. The particular Baptist Missionary Society no longer exists. And the Reformed Baptists, therefore, took over the hyper-Calvinist strict Baptist mission, which had been organized in the year 1861. Yes, that's right. The hyper-Calvinists, those who reject the doctrines of duty, faith, and the free offer, they organized the strict Baptist mission, which sent out hyper-Calvinist missionaries to the foreign field. And you see, it was that society, based on the teachings of hyper-Calvinism, which remained in existence during the 1950s, when the Reformed Baptist movement emerged. And, having taken it over, changed its doctrinal position to that of moderate Calvinism, yea, that of Fullerism, changing its name to Grace Baptist Mission. I believe that was done around the year 1980. And so I say in response to Jack Code's narrative, well, Fuller's book may well have led to the organization of the particular Baptist Missionary Society, and from it the modern missions movement as we know it today. Yet the society itself, nor such a movement, was intrinsically good or biblically sound. It certainly does not reflect the way in which Paul went about his evangelistic ministries during the New Testament era. And therefore all of this praise Hode heaps upon Fuller, in my view, is entirely unfounded. But watch. Hode continues, it had other effects too, principally in hardening the creed of those who disagreed. Well, Hode, of course, is referring to the hyper-Calvinists. He says Fuller's book hardened the creed of the hyper-Calvinists. I wonder what he means by this. Does he mean the hyper-Calvinists became more hyper than after Fuller's book was published? That they lost their minds and went entirely off the deep end? Or does he mean they simply became more rigid and committed to their hyper-Calvinism? Whatever he meant by it, the language used and the way he described hyper-Calvinists and their creed, well, it makes it sound like they were a bunch of unreasonable, stubborn, and hard-hearted bigots. That, my dear friends, although it only comes out by way of insinuation, is quite surprising. For I don't find such things in the historic records of that time. In fact, having come myself from the side of moderate Calvinism, deeply steeped in its framework and tenets, to that of hyper-Calvinism, I've discovered by personal observation and experience, within a modern context, the rigidness and stubbornness and hard-heartedness as it relates to one's creed is found on the moderate Calvinist side of the aisle. Their prejudice and bigotry is off the charts. Now, that's my personal experience and observations, having been in both camps. But watch, and please listen to me. Contrary to Hode's characterization, the historic documentation affirms that the hyper-Calvinists, together with not a few moderate Calvinists, stood shoulder to shoulder against the teachings of Andrew Fuller, because they recognized Fuller's teachings promoted theological liberalism. But there you have it. Jack Code's appraisal of Andrew Fuller, propping him up as a great and worthy defender of the Christian faith and of the particular Baptist denomination. The man who supposedly mirrors the Apostle Paul for reviving an evangelistic spirit within the particular Baptist denomination and spearheading the gospel to nations far and wide. And of course, I've attempted to give my response to Hode's appraisal. This brings us, and if you've been following thus far, you'll be glad to hear, this brings us to the end of the second chapter, and time for a well-deserved break. When we return, I will be sharing with you the appraisal given of Andrew Fuller by Kenneth Dix. I'll look forward to seeing you in a few moments. I'd like to welcome you back. I needed that break. I'm certain you did as well if you are following through each chapter of the episode. I'm happy to be back with you, and I'm going to try to slow up a bit. I felt I was speeding along towards the end of the last chapter. I just had so much to say, and I was skipping over my thoughts to get the words out. I'm going to try to slow up for this chapter, and I trust you'll be further blessed as we consider the way in which Kenneth Dix praised the life and legacy, the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. Kenneth Dix was another reputable Reformed Baptist preacher and a historian, and may I say, a pioneer of the Reformed Baptist movement. He served many decades as the secretary and chairman for the Strict Baptist Historical Society in England. Dating back to the 1980s and 90s, this society actually started meeting for its quarterly and annual meetings at the Baptist Chapel in London, where I was a member and grew up and would eventually become the pastor. I therefore knew Kenneth Dix early in life. However, it wasn't until I had been pastor for around 10 years that I developed a closer relationship with him, having come to him for counsel on several theological and historical matters. He was a gracious man. He was full of knowledge about the particular Baptist churches, as well as the Reformed Baptist movement, and actually, he distinguished between those two groups as entirely separate denominations. However, he remained a committed moderate Calvinist, and therefore ultimately aligned himself with the new ethos, generally speaking, of the Reformed Baptist movement. I like to read for you a statement from his book where even he praises the theological stance and doctrinal legacy of Andrew Fuller. In his book, published in 2001, entitled Strict and Particular, I'm going to read to you a statement by, I'll read for you a statement by Kenneth Dix as a whole, and then as I did for Jack Hode, I'll come back to the top and give my response to it. Kenneth Dix wrote, "For Fuller, the old paths were those of the 17th century Particular Baptists. For the Strict Baptists, they were those of the Particular Baptist Deviation and the teaching of John Brine and John Gill. The Strict Baptists did not treat Fuller with the respect he deserved as the leading Baptist theologian of his day. There was a failure to accept Fuller's testimony of his commitment to strict Calvinism, or of the very gracious way in which he wrote of his objections to mixed communion principles. There were certainly times when Fuller made statements which might have been construed as a departure from the particularist position. But this was not the case. His belief in an atonement that was sufficient for all men, but efficacious only for the elect, offended high Calvinists, but he never gave up the 17th century confessions. Andrew Fuller was no more responsible for any shift from Orthodox Calvinism in the 19th century than the men who framed the 1677 confession could be held responsible for the path taken by some of their descendants into the chilling winds of high Calvinism. Kenneth Dix, as Andrew Fuller did, Kenneth Dix uses high and hyper-Calvinism interchangeably. I like to go to the top of Dix's statement, and I'll begin my response there. I'll read it again carefully and listen. For Fuller, the old paths were those of the 17th century Particular Baptists. For the Strict Baptists, they were those of the Particular Baptist Deviation and the teaching of John Brine and John Gill. Now, before I give my response to Dix's appraisal, I should disclose that, like Hode, Dix became one of my mentors. He didn't serve in that capacity for very long, and unlike Hode, Dix became a mentor later on in my ministry, after I had become a hyper-Calvinist. But nevertheless, he did take me for a short time under his wing, and he mentored me in strict Baptist history and theology. In fact, his insights to the plural eldership issue were invaluable, as he came to repudiate that form of polity later in life. He even questioned the legitimacy of the 1966 Confession of Faith, put out by the Reformed Baptist movement, called We Believe. You notice the document is identified as the strict Baptist affirmation of faith. But Dix took the issue with this. He, in talking to me on the issue, asked, upon what authority did those men draw up a new confessional statement on behalf of the strict Baptist churches, which repudiated the doctrinal distinctive upon which those churches had been organized? Of course, this document was prepared by the Reformed Baptist movement in an effort to take control of the strict Baptist denomination, to take control of her churches, her chapels, her associations, her societies, her magazines, and other outlets. They accomplished their goal. I hope in upcoming episodes to talk about these things in more detail. Well, as I've said, I learned a great deal from Kenneth Dix. I wish he were still here today to impart his knowledge to all of us. And so, my response to his appraisal of Fuller is very much on par with that of Hode, in the sense that I'm critiquing the views of those who at one time served as my teachers, but I'm not attacking their persons. I begin my response, therefore, with the words I've just read for you. I want you to notice first, and at once, how Dix distinguished between the two sides of the modern question controversy. That of the so-called old paths of the 17th century, the theological framework of moderate Calvinism, and that of the so-called particular Baptist deviation in the teachings of John Brine and John Gill, the theological framework of hyper-Calvinism. A few things I wish to highlight here. First, since Dix takes sides with the theological framework of moderate Calvinism, he naturally refers to it as the old paths, whereas that of hyper-Calvinism he calls a deviation in the teachings of John Brine and John Gill. However, if one takes sides with the theological framework of hyper-Calvinism, as I do, then the same issues may be framed in the reverse. While maintaining the theological framework of moderate Calvinism as the old paths, yet the theological framework of hyper-Calvinism is viewed as the needed reforms to correct the problems of the old paths. You see, my dear friends, there's not a singular narrative for theology and historical issues. History is the story of the past, and the nature of the story very much depends on the one who's telling it. Now, I know the moderate Calvinists like to have a monopoly on history and theology. I know they like to think of themselves as the impartial umpires in what's true and what's false. But that, my dear friends, should in itself be a red flag that they're trying to control the narrative rather than welcoming the views of those who belong to the other side of the story. I therefore encourage you to step back from the histories you read and be willing to take a broader view of these things, considering both sides of the story. Yes, Kenneth Dix and the moderate Calvinists call the developed views of John Gill and the particular Baptists of the 18th century deviant teachings. But John Gill and the particular Baptists of that century and beyond would introduce and maintain important reforms to covenant theology. You see, there's different ways of looking at theology and history. So I challenge you, be your own person and investigate the issues from both sides of the controversy. The second thing I want to highlight here, notice how Dix refers to present-day strict Baptists as those who subscribe to the theological framework of hyper-Calvinism. The history of the present-day strict Baptists, of course, has its roots not only in the origin of the particular Baptists during the 17th century, but also in the doctrinal reforms introduced during the 18th century. These are the churches, the current-day churches, that have a direct link to the churches of the 17th century. Remember, however, the Reformed Baptists, generally speaking, are under the impression that particular Baptist churches remained a single denomination after Fuller led them back to the tenets of moderate Calvinism, and that the hyper-Calvinist churches were only a small and insignificant branch of relatively few churches. This, however, is a false view of history. The particular Baptist church is split into two separate denominations as a result of Fuller's teachings and influence. Although the moderate Calvinist section was the largest of the two denominations, this doesn't mean the hyper-Calvinist section was small and insignificant. In fact, a simple overview of what happened to these denominations throughout the 18th century demonstrates quite plainly which of the two denominations went from strength to strength. For instance, take the moderate Calvinist denomination, those churches which embrace the teachings of Andrew Fuller. In the year 1813, dozens of pastors met in the vestry of the Carter Lane Chapel. They organized a new association of churches. It's called the Baptist Union. John Rippon, the man who followed John Gill as pastor of the Carter Lane Chapel, and men such as Joseph Ivamy, a 19th century Baptist historian, they founded this new association for the purpose of uniting all Baptist churches in the country. Well, to make a long story short, the Fullerite churches eventually joined the Baptist Union. And because it had been founded upon the teachings of Andrew Fuller, the door was open for both Arminian and liberal churches to become members. And by the end of the 19th century, the technical date being 1891, the moderate Calvinist particular Baptist denomination, those churches which belonged to Fuller's teachings, they ceased to exist. However, the other denomination, that of the hyper-Calvinists, it remained entirely separate from the Baptist Union, from Andrew Fuller's teachings. Its churches either remained fiercely independent or else joined local and regional associations that had been founded upon the theological framework of hyper-Calvinism. Now this meant that when a new interest in 17th century moderate Calvinism emerged during the 1950s, that which would become known as the Reformed Baptist movement, the only particular Baptist denomination that was then in existence was that of the Hyper-Calvinists. Now, a little word about this, the Hyper-Calvinist denomination. By the 1920s, following the First World War, there began a slow but gradual falling away of many churches in the Hyper-Calvinist denomination. Some of them entertained the theological framework of moderate Calvinism. Others gave themselves over to outright Arminianism. In fact, such was the departure of many churches that the Gospel Standard section of the denomination chose to separate itself from the other strict Baptist churches during the 1930s. The Gospel Standard section remained true to its creed and continues to this day, subscribing to the theological framework of Hyper-Calvinism. The other strict Baptist churches, however, with a few exceptions, devolved into moderate Calvinist causes, all of which paralleled with the newly emerged Reformed Baptist movement of the 1950s. And you see, it was that section of the Hyper-Calvinist, particular Baptist denomination, the Reformed Baptists took over, rewriting its history and doctrinal statements, such as the 1966 Affirmation of Faith, and then eventually changing its very name from Strict and Particular Baptist to Reformed and Grace Baptist. On the one hand, it may be argued, the Reformed Baptists emerged from the Particular Baptist denomination. For by the 1960s, the vast majority of Reformed Baptist preachers were ministering in the old Hyper-Calvinist Particular Baptist chapels. And it's for that reason, early on in the transition between strict and Reformed teachings, the 1966 affirmation was called a strict Baptist statement of faith. About 10 years later, the name was changed to Grace Baptist. But on the other hand, it may be argued these Reformed Baptist preachers had no business, technically speaking, both from a doctrinal and historical perspective, ministering in these old Hyper-Calvinist Particular Baptist chapels. Their creed was staunchly opposed to that of Hyper-Calvinism, upon which these chapels had been built, along with the societies and associations and magazines. Now, you see, this backdrop of history is something Kenneth Dix very much understood, what I'm presenting to you here, which is in favor of the Hyper-Calvinist view of history. Kenneth Dix very much understood this. In fact, he it was that taught me these things when I came under his wing. Jack Hode taught me the perspective of the moderate Calvinists, whereas Kenneth Dix, though he also was a moderate Calvinist, taught me this perspective of the Hyper-Calvinists. And so he very much understood the things I'm explaining to you here. And yet, while he acknowledged this history, he also admitted that it was okay for these moderate Calvinist churches, which later became Reformed Baptists, to have taken on the roles of these causes of truth. My dear friends, when stepping back and viewing the history of the particular Baptist denominations in this way, it becomes quite apparent that the teachings of Andrew Fuller throughout the 19th century had been tried but found wanting. They failed. His denomination ended. The churches stopped. They became Arminian causes. And then, when the teachings took root again during the 1960s, under such men as Errol Hulse, Enough time has passed between then and now to arrive at the same conclusion. The teachings of Fullerism have been tried again and found wanting. You know, I've recently been looking up various Reformed Baptist churches online, scattered around England. I've been looking at their websites, studying their doctrinal statements, comparing it with their sermons and activities. I'm shocked how far many of them have shifted towards outright Arminianism. They claim to be Grace Baptist, they claim to be Reformed Baptist, but they have more in common with Arminianism, free will religion, than they do sovereign grace. Some even imbibing the theological liberalism of Fullerism. But we shouldn't be shocked. I shouldn't be shocked by this. For Fullerism has already proven its eventual decline into free will religion and theological liberalism, as we find it recorded throughout the 19th century. And so this is my response to Kenneth Dix as it relates to these two groups, the moderate Calvinist / Fullerites on the one hand, the hyper-Calvinist / strict Baptist on the other. That's the legacy of those denominations and of the teachings which undergird those denominations. But he continues, the strict Baptists did not treat Fuller with the respect he deserved as the leading Baptist theologian of his day. And I would ask, what measure of respect should the strict and particular Baptist have given to Fuller? The man was introducing an entirely new theology which flew in the face of 17th and 18th century Calvinism and denounced a number of major articles of the Christian faith. Who cares, therefore, whether Fuller was the leading Baptist theologian of his day? That alone doesn't earn for a person respect. If the leading theologian be a heretic in a number of doctrinal matters, then he's only a leading theologian because of his notoriety, not because of his orthodoxy. Dix seems to take the view that because Fuller was popular and influential, this must have made him orthodox in the faith. But what a strange way to measure truth claims. If we went by that measure, then James Arminius should have been given the respect due to him during the first part of the 17th century. And Richard Baxter should have been given the respect due to him during the last part of the 17th century. But you see, the Synod of Dort did not respect Arminius' teachings, nor did the particular Baptists respect Richard Baxter's teachings, because both men were promoting heresy. And so the strict and particular Baptists of the 18th century did not respect Andrew Fuller's teachings because he also was teaching heresy. But Dix continues, there was a failure to accept Fuller's testimony of his commitment to strict Calvinism, or the very gracious way in which he wrote of his objections to mixed communion principles. There was a failure to accept Fuller's testimony of his commitment to so-called strict Calvinism because strict Calvinism was not that which he taught in his book. For instance, he rejected the doctrine of total depravity. And now let me specify some of the areas where he modified the 5 points of Calvinism. He rejected the doctrine of total depravity by viewing man's natural faculties sinless, with only his moral propensities under sin's bondage. He rejected the doctrine of unconditional election by making it God's choice on the one hand from eternity, but man's choice on the other in time. He rejected the doctrine of limited and effectual atonement, believing it to be a universal provision contingent on those who believe. He rejected the doctrine of irresistible grace, believing the new birth, rather than imparting a new nature in Christ, restores man's old nature in Adam. Now, to my knowledge, the label Calvinism is a reference to the 5 points of Calvinism, and De Fuller modified at least 4 of them to the point that they no longer reflect the Calvinism of John Calvin, or the Calvinism of the Synod of Dort, or the Calvinism of the 17th century confessional statements, or the Calvinism of the hyper-Calvinists. Then it's an entirely new set of teachings, which is why it earned the name Fullerism instead of Calvinism. It's quite disingenuous for Fuller or anyone else to claim that his teachings represent strict or true Calvinism, when his version of Calvinism is like that of no other. In fact, the one who comes closest to Fuller's Calvinism was Richard Baxter, who also produced his own version of Calvinism, which is why people call it Baxterism or Neonomianism. So no, Fuller was not a strict or true Calvinist. He was his own version of Calvinism, which is better identified as Fullerism. But Dix continues, there were certainly times when Fuller made statements that might have been construed as a departure from the particularist position, but this was not the case. His belief in an atonement that was sufficient for all men, but efficacious only for the elect, offended hyper-Calvinists. But he never gave up the 17th century confessions. Well, let's do a little comparative study on Andrew Fuller and the 1689 Baptist Confession teachings on the atonement of Christ. Fuller taught that the atonement of Christ was has an unlimited virtue, sufficient to save every sinner, if every sinner were to believe on Christ, but that it's made effectual only to those who do believe on Christ. Henceforth, he believed in unlimited atonement, but embraced a sort of particular redemption. And you see, Dix is defending Fuller on this point, arguing that he never gave up the doctrinal position of the 17th century confessional statements. Well, would it surprise you to know, dear friends, that the 1689 Confession rejects this view of Fuller? The 1689 Confession teaches what's called the commensurate view of the atonement. That is, that the atonement of Christ is limited to the elect, sufficient to save only those who are actually redeemed by it. Now I'm going to show this to you from the confession itself. In chapter 8, on Christ the Mediator, and paragraph 8, I'll read for you. To all those for whom Christ hath obtained eternal redemption, he doth certainly and effectually apply and communicate the same, and all of free and absolute grace, without any condition foreseen in them, to procure it. Do you see? The obtaining of eternal redemption is by the atoning blood of Christ. And it's to all those, not of the world, but for whom Christ made an atonement, he does certainly and effectually apply, not conditioned upon the sinner's faith to receive it. Now this is a limited atonement made only for the elect, and therefore applied only to the elect. But this is not the teachings of Andrew Fuller. You see, Fuller could not argue for the doctrines of duty, faith, and the free offer on the basis of limited atonement. And so he had to modify the doctrine, taking the Arminian view on the one side, that the atonement is universal or unlimited, but trying to maintain the Calvinist view on the other side, that redemption is special or particular. But you see, Dix is telling us that this modification to the third point of Calvinism doesn't in any way diminish Fuller's adherence to the 17th century confessional statements. My dear friends, let's look at it this way. The acronym for the 5 points of Calvinism is destroyed by Andrew Fuller. For the L of tulip is rejected by him, thus making Fuller at best a 4-point Calvinist. But as I pointed out earlier, he was at best only a 1-point Calvinist, for he also modified the doctrines of total depravity, unconditional election, and irresistible grace. And you see, while comparing Fuller's teachings with that of the 1689 Confession, on this point of Christ's atonement, we actually have here one of the distinguishing doctrines which separated the Fullerites from the Gillites, or the moderate Calvinists from the hyper-Calvinists. This has far more to do with just the duty, faith, and free offer issue. We're dealing here with cardinal truths of the gospel, the atonement of the Lord Jesus Christ. The Fullerites subscribed to universal atonement in opposition to the 1689 Confession, whereas the Gillites subscribed to limited atonement in adherence with the 1689 Confession. Isn't it ironic, my dear friends, that although the hyper-Calvinists don't subscribe to the 1689 Confession, yet they're actually closer to its teachings on the atonement of Christ than the Reformed Baptists, who do subscribe to the 1689 Confession. But, Dix continues, Andrew Fuller was no more responsible for any shift from Orthodox Christianity in the 19th century than the men who framed the 1677 Confession could be held responsible for the path taken by some of their descendants into the chilling winds of hyper-Calvinism. Let me take the last statement first. The chilling winds of high or hyper-Calvinism? Really? Let me ask you, what became of Andrew Fuller's particular Baptist denomination? Is it alive today? Is it thriving as a so-called sovereign grace and reform group of churches? No. It died in the year 1891. In the same year, the Missionary Society of Fuller died. It therefore boggles the mind that Dix and the moderate Calvinists repeatedly sing the praises of Fuller's Calvinism and of Fuller's orthodoxy and of Fuller's evangelism and of Fuller's particular Baptist denomination and of Fuller's worldwide missionary enterprise, when it all came to a screeching end in less than 100 years after Fuller's death, and by one measure became the catalyst which put Charles Spurgeon into an early grave. The downgrade controversy occurred within Fuller's denomination, of which Spurgeon was a part. And Spurgeon testified that the downgrade controversy was killing him, and it did kill him. It was ultimately the result of the Fullerite teachings, of the 18th century. And yet, by the year 1900, well, Fuller's denomination ceased to exist. Do you know there were almost 600 hyper-Calvinist, particular Baptist churches scattered around England? Do you know how many churches that is? It's around 1/3 of all Baptist churches nationwide. Which of the two denominations were fruitful throughout the 19th century? Fuller's denomination or Gill's denomination? By far, Gill's denomination went from strength to strength. The chilling winds of hyper-Calvinism? I think Dix is confused with the chilling winds of Fullerism. But confused he seems to be again, because he identifies Fuller as the thoroughly orthodox and sound theologian, exonerating him of heresy. Yet earlier in his statement, calling the hyper-Calvinists, such as John Gill and John Brine, deviants from the faith. He's got it all backwards, my dear friends. And it saddens me greatly. For there's much in Dix's writings which is accurate and fair to hyper-Calvinism and their churches. But this statement, his appraisal of Andrew Fuller's teachings and legacy, I believe it missed the mark of historical accuracy and doctrinal discernment. But nevertheless, this was how Kenneth Dix appraised Fuller's teachings and legacy. He viewed Fuller as the hero who rescued the particular Baptist denomination from the chilling winds of hyper-Calvinism. He puts Fuller forth as a thoroughly orthodox Christian, a true stalwart of the faith, and a strict and true Calvinist. But this brings us to the end of the 3rd chapter. And once more, I appreciate your patience with me. You know, I have copious notes that I'm looking at, and there are ways I was envisioning on framing my thoughts for the episode, but as I'm teaching it, I just can't seem to get out clearly the thoughts I want to convey. And all I can do is apologize to you. There is no way on earth I'm going to go back and reteach these things so I can bring the teachings out more clearly. This is what it is, what I've given to you so far. Can only hope you've captured the points I've sought to make. It's been a challenge and a help to you. Let's take a needed break. Let's pray that when I return from the break, my thoughts will be fresher and clearer, and I'll be able to articulate more clearly for the final chapters my thoughts coming up. And that means we're going to be looking, when we return, at Tom Nettles' appraisal of Andrew Fuller. I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. I've enjoyed my break. I suspect you have as well. Let's see if we can make better progress in this chapter and I can articulate my thoughts more clearly. In the previous chapter, I spoke about the way Kenneth Dix appraised the teachings of Andrew Fuller and Fuller's legacy. For this chapter, we're looking at the way Tom Nettles does it. In essence, he believes Fuller was grounded in biblical exposition and theological reflection, and that his teachings will serve the cause of truth for generations to come. Tom Nettles is another Reformed Baptist preacher and historian, but unlike Hode and Dix, I can't remember meeting him. He serves, or at least he served, I'm not sure what he's doing now, as professor of historical theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He's dedicated much of his research and writings to the life and teachings of Andrew Fuller. He views Fuller as one of the most vital figures in Baptist history, accrediting his theological writings as the bedrock upon which moderate Calvinists today firmly stand. 2015, the Founders Journal dedicated its entire summer issue to the life and teachings of Andrew Fuller. This was in commemoration of Fuller's 200th death anniversary. Now, the Founders Journal, if I remember correctly, was founded in the year 1990 under the auspices of the Founders Ministries. It's a theological journal. It's designed to promote the teachings of moderate Calvinism. Well, for the 2015 issue, Tom Nettles was invited to write the introduction, entitled 200 Years Ago, the World Lost a Good Friend. I now quote a portion of his article. Nettles writes, Fuller's writings and preaching constitute a large body of work and are worthy of the critical edition of his works presently in production. His sound discussions on law and gospel, the nature of saving faith, the person and work of Christ, the character of divine revelation, the nature of justification, the Spirit's work in regeneration, the eternal generation of the Son, the Christocentric principle in Scripture, the intrinsic and extrinsic credibility of the Christian faith, his insightful engagement with Socinianism and deism, and other subjects will benefit all Christians for decades to come. Though he wrote for immediately relevant occasions, the character of his discussion was so grounded in biblical exposition and theological reflection that his doctrinal treatises, polemical engagements, and apologetic discussions have a timeless quality to them that will serve the cause of truth in any generation. This edition of the Founders Journal is dedicated on the 200th anniversary of the death of Fuller to seek to demonstrate the edifying usefulness of a grasp of Fuller's thought. This is high praise, very high praise of the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. Let me respond from the top. Fuller's writings and preaching constitute a large body of work and are worthy of the critical edition of his works presently in production. Well, the critical edition of Fuller's works presently in production is a reference to the work being done by Michael Haykin under the umbrella of the Andrew Fuller Center for Baptist Studies, located at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. The project has promised a total in excess of 16 volumes, which would include not only the works already in print, but a plethora of new materials never before set in print. Now, this, of course, will greatly benefit scholars and historians as they continue to examine the teachings of Fuller. I can't say they'll benefit many others beyond those circles, because very few Reformed believers, including preachers, care to read him. Although they're all convinced Fuller was a true Calvinist and Orthodox Christian. But watch, Nettles continues, his sound discussions on law and gospel, the nature of saving faith, the person and work of Christ, the character of divine revelation, the nature of justification, the Spirit's work in regeneration, the eternal generation of the Son, the Christocentric principle in Scripture, the intrinsic and extrinsic credibility of the Christian faith, his insightful engagement with Socinianism and deism, and other subjects will benefit all Christians for decades to come. Well, I can tell you on good authority, on the authority of Fuller himself, according to his own writings, that he was quite unsound on the doctrines of law and gospel, on the nature of saving faith, on the work of Christ, on the nature of justification, and on the Spirit's work in regeneration, not forgetting many other vital doctrines of the Christian faith. I mean, one must be reading Fuller with a blind eye in order to miss the heretical views he wrote into his theology. But Nettles continues, though he wrote for immediately relevant occasions, the character of his discussion was so grounded in biblical exposition and theological reflection that his doctrinal treatises, polemical engagements, and apologetic discussions have a timeless quality to them that will serve the cause of truth in any generation. Well, Nettles makes a good point. Where is this? Just at the top of his statement. He says, Fuller wrote for immediately relevant occasions. Because Fuller's writings tend to be knee-jerk reactions to those who opposed him or on issues that were dropped on his doorstep. His theological teachings were formed, you see, not as a proactive statement on what he believed from the ground up. First laying the foundation and then building on it. But rather, his theological teachings were formed in a series of reactionary statements to things he encountered or things which encountered him throughout the course of his ministry. And it's for that reason his theological teachings grew and expanded as the years went on, making new modifications to Calvinism and Christianity from one reactionary response to the next. It's also for this reason Fuller's theological teachings are not arranged in systematic order. If one is to understand Fuller's theological framework, one must do the hard work combing through his works and arranging his views in a logical and methodical order. But notice, Nettles then characterizes Fuller's teachings as being grounded firmly in biblical exposition. He says his writings will serve the cause of truth for generations to come. Well, one must remember that biblical exposition is not divorced from hermeneutical principles. And therefore, while he may have opined at great length on many texts of Scripture, Fuller did opine at great length on many texts of Scripture. That alone does not distinguish Fuller as a Bible expositor for the cause of truth. John Nelson Darby, the father of modern dispensationalism, together with Cyrus Scofield, who popularized the teachings in his Scofield Study Bible, both of these men wrote at great length about the texts of Scripture, even claiming to rightly divide the word of truth. But neither man is recognized as true Bible expositors by moderate or hyper-Calvinists, properly speaking. And so I say of Andrew Fuller, just because his works are filled with Bible texts upon which he opined, does not make him a legitimate Bible scholar. In fact, on some level, Fuller did with the Scriptures what Darby and Scofield did with them, developing a new theology which lended support to a preconceived set of beliefs. A new theology not of dispensationalism, but of Fullerism. Thus, it's highly objectionable to identify Fuller's theology as something that will serve the cause of truth for generations to come. But Nettles goes on. He says, this edition of the Founders Journal is dedicated on the 200th anniversary of the death of Fuller to seek to demonstrate the edifying usefulness of a grasp of Fuller's thought. And here again, Nettles describes Fuller's teachings as edifying and useful. I have no doubt Fuller's writings are edifying and useful to those who have aligned themselves with his modified Calvinism and revised Christianity. But for those who subscribe to old orthodoxy, an orthodoxy, by the way, which is shared both by moderate and hyper-Calvinists of the 17th and 18th centuries, there's very little in the writings of Fuller that's edifying or useful. But there it is, Tom Nettles' appraisal of Andrew Fuller, giving him a glowing rating with 5 stars and a gold badge. Fuller's teachings, says Nettles, were grounded in biblical exposition, theological reflection. They'll serve the cause of truth for generations to come. Well, this brings us to the end of the 4th chapter. Time for another break, and when we return, I'll be looking at the way in which Errol Hulse described the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. I'll see you in a few minutes. I'd like to welcome you back. I suspect the final chapters of this episode are going to be much shorter than the first few chapters. And I appreciate, if you're listening to me, you're staying with me in the teaching. I appreciate you coming along so far with me in these teachings. I know it's protracted. I know it's long. And I know I've been long-winded in some of the chapters. As I apologized earlier to you, I haven't been able to effectively articulate my thoughts in a way that would be succinct and short. My apologies to you. I've done my best to condense what I want to say, but it's going to turn out to be a long episode. I'm just thankful you have different places in the episode you can take a break and have a breather and come back refreshed. Hoping that you are now refreshed, let's take a look at this next chapter. I like to look at the way Errol Hulse goes about appraising the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. Errol Hulse was a Reformed Baptist preacher and historian, arguably one of the founding elders of the Reformed Baptist movement. I never met him, which is my loss. Although I don't agree with most of his theology or the way in which he twisted the history of the strict and particular Baptist churches, yet he was one of the leading men who spearheaded the Reformed Baptist movement, and therefore it would have been a great privilege to have met him in person. He's most widely known for starting the Reformation Today magazine. Now keep in mind, Errol Hulse was responsible for bringing to an end the hyper-Calvinist Particular Baptist magazine called The Christian's Pathway. Now, one might think this was a strategic move on the part of the Reformed Baptists, because in the same year, 1970, when Hulse brought an end to the Christian's Pathway, another hyper-Calvinist Particular Baptist magazine called the Earthen Vessel and Gospel Herald, it was also brought to an end. The Christian's Pathway was replaced with Errol Hulse's new moderate Calvinist Reformed Baptist magazine called Reformation Today, while the Gospel Herald and Earthen Vessel was replaced with the new moderate Calvinist Reformed Baptist magazine called Grace. However, the Reformation Today magazine served a global audience, whereas the Grace magazine served a city-wide audience of London, designed to branch out to other parts of England. Well, in the first issue of the Reformation Today magazine for the year 1970, Hulse appraised the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. I like to read for you a statement from that issue. Errol Hulse wrote, "Hyper-Calvinism largely explains why it took some time for the evangelical awakening of the 18th century to have effect upon the Particular Baptists. Andrew Fuller was one of the main instruments used to overcome the hyper-Calvinism which had spread among the churches. appearing in 1784, Fuller's The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, caused an immediate storm. The hyper-Calvinists fired a broadside from one side, and the General Baptists ranked him with gunshot from the other. But now Fuller had come to detest both hyperism and Arminianism. He was well and truly fixed in the saddle of Puritan theology, without any danger of falling off front, back, or sides. His theology was soundly scriptural and sanely balanced, and he held the antinomy of predestination and responsibility with an iron grasp. Fuller's book, opening up the whole question of the moral responsibility of sinners in regard to the gospel, was mightily used in his day and has been a blessing ever since. Well, let me respond to this from the top. Hyper-Calvinism largely explains why it took some time for the evangelical awakening of the 18th century to have effect upon the particular Baptists. Now, this goes to show that while the popularity, listen to this, while the popularity of Andrew Fuller only began to take traction during the 1990s, I pointed this out in the introduction. The pioneering leaders of the Reform movement were already promoting Fuller's teachings during the 1970s. Now, looking at this statement I've just read of Hulse, I have to ask, really? I mean, this myth has been propagated ever since Joseph Ivamy recorded incomplete numbers in his Baptist history. Hyper-Calvinism largely explains why it took some time for the evangelical awakening of the 18th century to have effect upon the particular Baptists. That's propaganda, my dear friends. That is an incorrect statement. That is misrepresenting the teachings of hyper-Calvinism and of the particular Baptist churches of the 18th century. You see, in 1814, Ivamy, this Baptist historian, began to publish several volumes on Baptist history. In his fourth volume, he sets out the number of churches that were then in existence during the 18th century. However, when he investigated these numbers, he consulted incomplete records, thus resulting in a much lower number of churches, from which Ivamy drew the conclusion, the false conclusion, that hyper-Calvinism was the cause for the particular Baptist denomination's decline throughout the 18th century. And you see, it's from these false numbers, together with Ivamy's false judgments against hyper-Calvinism, that present-day moderate Calvinists, such as Errol Hulse, have continued to spread the false information. To say the churches of the 18th century were in decline, these churches subscribed to hyper-Calvinism. Hyper-Calvinism, therefore, is the reason these churches were in decline. Hyper-Calvinism, therefore, rejects evangelism, kills the life and witness of churches. To say that is entirely unfounded. The whole line of reasoning, my dear friends, is based on the miscalculations and false conclusions of an old Baptist historian and regurgitated by modern-day moderate Calvinists. Did you know in 2001, Clive Jarvis wrote a thesis paper for the University of Glasgow detailing the growth rather than the decline in English particular Baptist churches throughout the 18th century? He provides source materials that show a far larger number of particular Baptist churches throughout the 18th century, completely dispelling this myth that under the hyper-Calvinist teachings of men such as John Gill and John Bryan, the particular Baptist churches were on the brink of extinction. Indeed, the evangelical awakening of the 18th century, led by men such as George Whitefield, was deeply felt among the particular Baptists at the time. But you see, these churches grew under the gospel ministries of the hyper-Calvinists, John Gill and John Bryan. I mean, John Gill and John Bryan should be listed alongside the evangelistic endeavors of men such as George Whitefield and others of the Great Awakening, such as John Wesley. For these men were no less evangelistically driven than a Whitefield or a Wesley. Of course, for Wesley, I would classify him as a proselyter rather than an evangelist. And that's the thing with Bryan and Gill's teachings. Not only were they evangelistically driven, but they had a clearer gospel even to that of George Whitefield himself. And that's why I say, my dear friends, examine the teachings of hyper-Calvinism. It does not deny the preaching of the gospel to the entire world, but the gospel it does preach to the entire world is a clear and sharp message of sovereign grace. But listen, this lie introduced by Joseph Ivamy has been repeated so many times by the moderate Calvinists, it's become truer than truth itself. And that's why we have Errol Hulse repeating it here in his appraisal of Andrew Fuller and the particular Baptist churches. But Hulse continues. He says, Andrew Fuller was one of the main instruments used to overcome the hyper-Calvinism which had spread among the churches. Well, Hulse wants to glorify Fullerism by vilifying hyper-Calvinism. You see, if he can take attention away from the actual teachings of Andrew Fuller, put the focus on the so-called evils of hyper-Calvinism, then he can exonerate Fuller of heresy. And you see, that's what Hulse does here. He says Fuller overcame hyper-Calvinism, and that's it. That's all that's needed for Fuller to be a true Calvinist and thoroughly orthodox in the faith. He overcame the evils of hyper-Calvinism. But nowhere does Hulse deal with the many heresies imbibed by Fuller and perniciously spread throughout the particular Baptist churches. But Hulse continues. He says, appearing in 1784, Fuller's The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation caused an immediate storm. The hyper-Calvinists fired a broadside from one side, and the General Baptists ranked him with gunshot from the other. But now Fuller had come to detest both hyperism and Arminianism. Well, I have to say, my dear friends, it has been said, if you try to make everybody happy, you'll end up making nobody happy. And this was the case with Andrew Fuller. He left in his theology enough Calvinism to make it Calvinistic. But he added to his theology enough Arminianism to make it Arminian. And in the end, he upset the Calvinists and the Arminians. Now you see, Hulse doesn't frame it that way, does he? He makes it sound like Fuller restored a balance to theology, that his teachings found a happy medium between sovereign grace salvation and free will religion, between divine sovereignty and human responsibility, between Calvinism and Arminianism. But you see, this isn't a balanced theology. It's an impure mixture of things that should never have been joined together. What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. And well may it also be said, what God has put asunder, let no man join together. But Fuller joined together sovereign grace, salvation, with free will religion, creating a grotesque theological monster with two heads. I will, Lord willing, as I've been saying to you, begin showing you this monster in the next episode. But look, Hulse says that Fuller came to detest hyperism and Arminianism. Well, please listen. Hyperism, when compared to the modifications made by Fuller, was nothing other than Calvinism, like 17th century Calvinism. That was the orthodoxy of hyper-Calvinism compared to Fuller's modifications. And you see, the reason Fuller came to detest 17th century Calvinism and Arminianism is because he joined them together in an unholy matrimony, and no longer could he take the one without having in company the other. He was truly a Calminian, or Fullerite. But Hulse continues. He says, he was well and truly fixed in the saddle of Puritan theology without any danger of falling off front, back, or sides. Now it's difficult to know what Hulse means by identifying Fullerism with Puritan theology, unless, of course, he's referring to the Puritan Richard Baxter, whose heretical views on Neonomianism are actually interwoven through the writings of Andrew Fuller. But Hulse continues, his theology was soundly scriptural and sanely balanced, and he held the antinomy of predestination and responsibility with an iron grasp. Well, there's that antinomy. Remember from our second episode when I shared a quote by Martin Lloyd-Jones, who went into great detail about how one must interpret the scriptures by this law of antinomy, or this law of contradiction? Well, Hulse has taken that bait, hook, line, and sinker. Hulse bought into this ridiculous notion of necessary contradictions in gospel truth. You see, Martin Lloyd-Jones was the single greatest influence on Hulse's life and ministry. He was deeply impressed by Lloyd-Jones and structured his theological bearings around Lloyd-Jones' teachings. And this is why we're not at all surprised to find Hulse using this type of language of an antinomy. Well, Hulse says Fuller held to the law of contradictions, particularly the contradiction between predestination, or divine sovereignty, and human responsibility. And he held to it with an iron grasp. Well, my dear friends, this is the theological framework of moderate Calvinism, isn't it? And it's true, that was the overarching framework of Fuller's theology. But to say that Fuller was soundly scriptural and sanely balanced, at least from the standpoint of 17th century Calvinism, according to the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith, that's an error of judgment of the highest order. This is like one arguing the teachings of Richard Baxter, whom I've referred to a few times in this episode, were soundly scriptural and sanely balanced. Oh, wait. That is what many Reformed Baptists have recently been saying about Richard Baxter's teachings. Why should we be surprised when the theologies of Baxter and Fuller are so closely aligned? But Hulse continues, Fuller's book opening up the whole question of the moral responsibility of sinners in regard to the gospel, was mightily used in his day and has been a blessing ever since. Well, I certainly agree. Fuller's book was mightily used in his day, but not for the good. He had a baneful influence upon the churches, ripping apart the particular Baptist denomination, and in time leading his group by his theological liberalism to extinction. But you see, this is how Arrowholz appraised Andrew Fuller and his teachings and legacy. He says Fuller was soundly scriptural and sanely balanced and mightily used in his day and has been a blessing ever since. This brings us to the end of the 5th chapter. Time for another break, and when we return, we'll be looking at the appraisal given by Michael Haykin, perhaps the so-called expert of Andrew Fuller in our modern day. We'll take a brief look at how he appraises the teachings and legacy of Fuller. I'll see you in just a few moments. I'd like to welcome you back. If you're still with me, you've made it to the 6th and final chapter. Now, I warn you, at the end of this chapter, I haven't yet finished. I have a little conclusion to draw everything together, but I'm happy you've joined me again. We're looking at Michael Haykin and the way in which he appraised the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. Who is Michael Haykin? Well, he probably needs no introduction. Michael Haykin is a Reformed Baptist historian and author. He serves as a professor of church history at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, you might remember when I introduced Tom Nettles that he too is connected with the same seminary. Well, keep in mind, the seminary was founded in 1859. Around 15 years after the Southern Baptist Convention was organized. Its theological ethos was that of moderate Calvinism, and in particular, the modified teachings of Andrew Fuller. It's therefore not surprising that the vast majority of these leading historians today who opine on Andrew Fuller are connected with the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Well, in the year 2007, Haykin actually helped found the Andrew Fuller Center for Baptist Studies at the seminary. The center is an institution which exists for the study and promotion of Fuller's theology. Haykin believes Andrew Fuller was one of the most outstanding theologians of all time. And while he's occasionally acknowledged that Fuller's writings contain references to what some may interpret as heresy, he cautiously walks a thin line, arguing we mustn't take Fuller at face value when we read such things in his writings. He argues that Fuller must be read with a grain of salt, as it were, that we should pretend Fuller didn't really mean what he wrote. In any case, it's pleasing to hear a true Fullerite at least admit the teachings of Fuller sometimes sound like heresy. Well, Haykin wrote an article entitled Hyper-Calvinism and the Theology of John Gill. I'm sorry, I don't know the date this was published, but I like to read a short excerpt from this article. Haykin wrote, Gill's theology did hamper passionate evangelism and outreach. But in the long run, this man's theology was used by God when revival came to the Baptists at the close of the 18th century. In a world in which men were abandoning the main contours of biblical orthodoxy, the infallibility of the Word of God, the doctrines of the Trinity, the incarnation and resurrection of Christ. Gill held fast to all these and enabled the Calvinistic Baptists to weather the intellectual storms of the 18th century. And in so doing, his fidelity gave form and shape to the coals of orthodoxy upon which the fire of revival fell later in the century through men like Andrew Fuller, John Ryland Jr., and William Carey. Well, let me respond from the top. Haykin says Gill's theology did hamper passionate evangelism and outreach. Really? On what evidence is this statement made? That of Joseph Ivamy, the same resource from which Errol Hulse accused the hyper-Calvinists of killing an evangelistic spirit during the 18th century? Or did Haykin do what a good theologian and historian is expected to do? Investigate the sermons of John Gill. The sermons Gill preached to his congregation, to discover whether or not Gill's theology hampered passionate evangelism and outreach. You see, if one takes the time to read the sermons of Gill, one would be happily surprised to find an evangelistic spirit throughout his pulpit ministry. Yes, Gill rejected the doctrines of duty, faith, and the free offer. But he was a passionate gospel preacher, believing in the Great Commission and setting forth the good news of glad tidings to all who would hear it. Haykin appears to be under the impression, as so many moderate Calvinists are, that a rejection of duty, faith, and the free offer must by default mean a rejection of evangelism and outreach. That, my dear friends, is total nonsense. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, you'll not find one example of a hyper-Calvinist preacher who rejected the Great Commission or who denied the essential duty of believers to evangelize, or the essential necessity of sinners who have been born again to savingly believe on Christ. This is therefore an irresponsible statement made by Haykin, based either on poor scholarship or, like so many before him, irrational prejudices. But Haykin continues, he writes, "But in the long run, this man's theology was used by God when revival came to the Baptists at the close of the 18th century. In the long run. What about the short run? Short and long, Gill's theology had a fruitful impact upon the particular Baptist churches of the 18th century. I remind you, whereas the particular Baptist denomination following the teachings of Andrew Fuller came to an end by the year 1900, the particular Baptist denomination following the teachings of John Gill continues to this day. And by the year 1900, when the Fullerite churches ceased to exist, there were almost 600 Gillite chapels scattered throughout England. Henceforth, it was Gill's theology and evangelistic zest which fueled the conversion of sinners and multiplication of particular Baptist churches throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, not that of Fuller. But Haykin continues. He says, in a world in which men were abandoning the main contours of biblical orthodoxy, the infallibility of the Word of God, the doctrines of the Trinity, the incarnation and resurrection of Christ, Gill held fast to all these and enabled the Calvinistic Baptist to weather the intellectual storms of the 18th century. And in so doing, His fidelity gave form and shape to the coals of orthodoxy upon which the fire revival fell later in the century, through men like Andrew Fuller, John Ryland Jr., and William Carey. Well, you may at first think Haykin is pouring tons of praise on John Gill and his theological legacy. But in actual fact, when you read this statement as a whole, you quickly discover he says all of these nice things about Gill in order to pour even greater praise on Andrew Fuller and his legacy. For, says Haykin, the theology of John Gill, however great that was, gave a form and shape to the coals of orthodoxy upon which the fire of revival fell later in the 18th century through men like Andrew Fuller. Wow! So, in an attempt to exonerate Fuller of heresy, Haykin clothes Fuller with the robe of Gill's theology. He says Gill's theology gave form and shape to the coals of orthodoxy that fell upon Andrew Fuller. My dear friends, if you were in my shoes, having read the works of both men, Gill and Fuller, you'd understand my astonishment at such a statement. The theological framework of Gill looked absolutely nothing like that of Fuller. The two men taught entirely different theologies. I'm simply dumbfounded how one can read the works of these men on whichever side of the fence they belong, whether they be a moderate Calvinist or a hyper-Calvinist. I'm dumbfounded how one can read the works of these men and come to the conclusion that Fuller stood on the foundation of Gill's orthodoxy, or that Fuller wore the robe of Gill's orthodoxy, or that the conservatism of Gill's teachings fell as a fire upon the liberalism of Fuller's teachings. The whole thing is utter nonsense. What we have here is an attempt on Haykin's part to cover up Fuller's heresy by clothing him in Gill's orthodoxy. It's putting lipstick on the pig. But you see, this is the way in which Michael Haykin, the leading scholar and expert in our day on the theology of Andrew Fuller, this is how he appraises the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. And this brings me, I'm happy to say, to the end of this last chapter. And I want to take another break. I know it's only a conclusion, but I don't know, maybe 10 minutes for the conclusion. So time for a little break. And then when we return, if you are still with me, we'll close everything up, tie together these loose ends. I'll see you in just a few minutes. Welcome back. I suspect nobody's joined me this far, has followed me this far in the episode. Extremely long. And if you have, you're probably one of two that have done it. But I appreciate if you're with me on this introduction. Thank you so much for following. I want to bring this to a conclusion by tying together the loose ends. And I might as well just speak my mind here. It's been so long, I don't have to close this up in 2 minutes. I say it's going to be about a 10-minute conclusion. I get a little personal here. I like to just summarize what I've looked at so far in this episode, and then perhaps respond to some objections I can imagine some might have to the podcast that I'm producing. Well, let me begin by giving a little summary of what I've attempted to show you in this episode. I've attempted to give you an idea on how modern-day moderate Calvinists view the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. He's invariably seen as the hero who rescued the particular Baptist churches from the cold grip of hyper-Calvinism, as the man who restored 17th century moderate Calvinism as expressed by the major confessional statements of that era, and one who set the particular Baptist churches on a balanced footing, reviving an evangelistic spirit and spearheading the modern-day missionary movement. They see him also as an orthodox theologian, defending the fundamentals of the Christian faith and maintaining a balance between free grace salvation and free will religion, all of which is supported by sound exposition of the Scriptures. In their view, the greatest need for today's generation, especially the preachers whose job it is to distill gospel truth to their congregations, is for the teachings of Fuller to once again gain the foothold within the Reformed Baptist movement, as it did within the particular Baptist denomination during the turn of the 19th century. For this reason, Michael Haykin, in the year 2007, organized the Andrew Fuller Center for Baptist Studies, located at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Each year, the center hosts academic conferences and produces, whether in-house or out-of-house, podcasts and other video resources, all in an effort to promote Fullerism. The center also puts out a biannual, open access, peer-reviewed journal, all in an effort to spark greater interest in and enthusiasm for Andrew Fuller. However, the center's most significant undertaking is the printing of a new set of Fuller works, to be compiled in more than 16 volumes, some of the writings having never been printed before. And whereas men such as Michael Haykin tip their hats to the celebrated John Gill, acknowledging him to be a worthy theologian, yet they use Gill's orthodoxy as a cloak around which to cover Andrew Fuller's heresies, thus diminishing Gill as a lesser theologian than Fuller, but using Gill's orthodoxy to hide the errors of Fullerism. In a nutshell, that's the appraisal of modern-day Reformed Baptists, generally speaking, to the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller. In response, I tried to give the other side of the story. For as I keep saying in this podcast, there's two sides to the story. And sadly, the only side that seems to be circulating in mainstream circles is that of the Reformed Baptists. But there's two sides to the story. Hold up, you might say. Yeah, there's two sides of the story because you're creating a side that doesn't exist. You're making it up. You're revising history in order to make it look like hyper-Calvinism is good and biblical. My dear friend, the story isn't created by me. It's not a fabrication of my views, nor is it something novel that's never been stated before. The other side of the story is embraced by all hyper-Calvinists, especially those who belong to the particular Baptist denomination. More than this, the other side of the story is the story recorded in the hyper-Calvinist literature dating back to the 18th century and continues to this day. You see, what's unbeknown to the vast majority of Reformed Baptist believers today is that the hyper-Calvinist particular Baptist denomination recorded its history in a wide range of local and national papers, together with hundreds, if not thousands, of published books and sermons, letters and biographies, detailing the history and teachings of their churches. And all of it is confirmed by the minute books of each church, which tells the story of the life and activities of each congregation, together with the hyper-Calvinist teachings that undergirded each church. And you see, all I'm doing in this podcast is telling you that side of the story. I'm telling you their side of the story. The side of the story either ignored by men such as Jack Code, Errol Hulse, Tom Nettles, Michael Haykin, or else, and worse, misrepresented by these men in an effort to claim the history and heritage of the particular Baptist denomination for themselves. To that end, that is, to the end of telling the other side of the story, I've answered many of the myths and misrepresentations peddled out by these men. You're right, I haven't given to you the evidence for our side of the story, but I will. If the Lord allows me to continue this podcast, I'll be showing you the evidence for everything I've mentioned in this episode and much, much more. You'll then be put into a strategic position of being able to compare both sides of the story, reaching your own conclusions about the teachings and legacy of Andrew Fuller and the moderate Calvinists, compared with the teachings and legacy of John Gill and the hyper-Calvinists. I'm not afraid of the truth. Are you? Let's put all the evidence out there so people can make up their own minds on these issues, rather than being hoodwinked by those who tell only one side of the story. But you might say, I've already read the writings of men such as Stanley Phillips and George Ella, and all you're doing is parroting their propaganda. Well, first, their writings are only propaganda if what they say isn't supported by the facts. You'll discover, if you take the time to do it, that their writings, unlike the moderate Calvinists of our day, their writings reference original source materials, rather than those in their own little bubble, as I say the moderate Calvinists almost invariably do. Moderate Calvinists of our day frequently quote each other rather than original source materials, thus, creating an impressive list of references is in essence the parroted views of those who continue to peddle out the same old myths. Thus I say to you, my friend, the propaganda is not to be found in the writings of George Ella or Stanley Phillips. The propaganda is to be found in the writings of the moderate Calvinists. But putting that to the side, I can assure you I do not parrot the views of anyone. That which I give to you in this podcast is the product of my own research and understanding. As a whole, it's representative of the hyper-Calvinists, but as I explain it historically, theologically, with diagrams and visual aids, it's all my own. I'm certain, for instance, if you were to clump my teachings with those of, let's say, Stanley Phillips or George Ella, or even those belonging to the Gospel Standard Churches of England, none of them would want to sign their names to this podcast. None of them would present the teachings or diagram the systems of theology in the way that I've done it. Probably a good many of them would be against such diagrams and visual aids. They prefer these things to be presented in writing and not even in the format of a podcast. I say these things to assure you I'm not parroting, nor do I represent any other person or group other than myself. My dear friend, and I speak modestly here, having read the works of Gill and Fuller, and researched the history of Calvinism and of the particular Baptist denomination, I speak on the authority of my own studies and understanding of these issues. And therefore, I'm especially thankful to the Baptist Particular, which gives me this space to produce these types of resources. But you say, who cares what you have to say about these things? Who are you that I should give heed to your views? Well, I'm nobody. So why are you listening to what I have to say? Don't listen. I mean, if you're looking for a set of academic qualifications that would give me clout in your mind, I don't have any. I have no fancy degrees hanging on my wall. I have no elite titles or letters before or after my name. I belong to no recognized school or institution, either as a graduate or a professor. I've written no thesis paper. I've published no books on history or theology. I've never pastored a church larger than 130 congregants. And I've never organized a movement with disciples that serve as my foot soldiers. I don't belong to a large and formidable denomination such as the Reformed Baptists, the Presbyterian Church in America, or the Protestant Reformed Churches of America. I therefore don't have the backing of a dozen scholarly friends to recommend my views or stand shoulder to shoulder with me when attacked. I've got none of these things, dear friends. I stand on my own 2 feet. I preach the gospel at every given opportunity. I minister to those the Lord brings into my life. I study the Scriptures as a disciple of Christ. I research history, both in its circumstantial and theological contexts, drawing my own conclusions on what I find. And although I'm aligned with the particular Baptist denomination in England, yet I'm not even a part of it. If anything, I'm an independent gospel preacher, unfettered by denominations and academic institutions. And so, you're right, I don't have the academic qualifications many people look for in one who opines on history and theology. But that's okay. That's not how the Lord's governed my life. It's not what I've ever sought throughout the course of my life. And therefore, whatever views I put out, obviously, they're not intended for those requiring qualifications I don't have. But perhaps there's some people who don't make those requirements the standard by which to measure the competency and the legitimacy of a person's research and a person's views. And you see, if you're one of those people, then it's actually for you I'm producing this podcast, trusting it to the Lord to serve as a help in one way or another in your journey with Him. After all, the 2 men I've been discussing, John Gill and Andrew Fuller, did you know that neither of them had more than a middle school education? They were both self-taught men. I suppose from that perspective, I'm a step ahead of them, because at least I have a high school education. All right, well, if you join me again for the next episode, I'll begin diagramming the theological frameworks of Andrew Fuller and John Gill, the most significant particular Baptist theologians of the 18th century. And I believe if you join me with an open mind and an open heart, you'll come to see why the hyper-Calvinists have warned about the dangers of Fullerism since the 18th century. At best, it's an enemy to the gospel of Christ. At worst, it's blasphemy against the triune Jehovah. But until next time, I want to wish upon you joy in the God of your salvation, trusting you're able to rejoice in the Lord God of your strength, praying He'll make your feet like hinds' feet and will make you to walk upon your high places. Habakkuk chapter 3, dear friend. That's my wish for you. Until we meet again next time, may God bless you.